The room went dead silent when the mechanic in grease-stained flannel stood up and said 5 words that would destroy a millionaire's empire. "Your building is going to collapse." Every eye turned. Every conversation stopped. The man they'd been mocking all night, the single father who smelled like motor oil and looked like he couldn't afford the beer he was drinking, had just challenged the most powerful developer in the city. And the worst part? He was right. Stay with me until the end of this story to see how a man everyone underestimated brought an entire corporation to its knees without raising his voice once. And if this story reaches you, hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Caleb's truth can travel. The fluorescent lights of Danny's bar cast a tired yellow glow across scratched wooden tables and vinyl booth seats that had seen better decades. It was the kind of place where downtown professionals stopped for exactly one drink before heading home to their renovated lofts and pristine condos. A transitional space between the polished marble lobbies of their office buildings and the climate-controlled comfort of their private lives. Caleb Moore occupied the corner of the bar like a piece of mismatched furniture someone had forgotten to remove. His flannel shirt, faded blue and forest green, carried the permanent creases of a man who owned 3 of the same and rotated them weekly. The collar was frayed at the edges. His jeans bore the honest stains of transmission fluid and engine grease that no amount of washing could fully erase. His work boots, scuffed brown leather with red laces gone pink from age, rested flat on the brass footrail, completely still. He nursed a beer he'd been working on for 40 minutes, the condensation forming a perfect ring on the napkin beneath it. Around him, the Thursday evening crowd filled the space with the particular energy of people who'd survived another week and were celebrating with controlled enthusiasm. Groups of 2 and 3 clustered at tables, their voices rising and falling in rhythmic waves of conversation. Laughter punctuated stories about difficult clients and incompetent colleagues. Ties had been loosened, top buttons undone. The performance of professionalism was giving way to something more relaxed, though no less calculated. Caleb didn't fit the pattern. He sat alone, shoulders relaxed, gaze distant, but not uncomfortable. There was a stillness to him that stood in sharp contrast to the animated gestures and projected voices surrounding him. He wasn't scrolling through a phone, wasn't checking the time, wasn't watching the door or the television mounted in the corner showing a basketball game no one was really watching. He was simply present, occupying space without apology or explanation. Is that guy homeless or something? The question came from a nearby table, spoken just loud enough to carry. Male voice, mid-30s, the kind of casual cruelty that masqueraded as curiosity. Probably wandered in from the bus station. A woman's voice, equally careless. Should we tell Danny? Caleb's expression didn't change. His hand remained steady on his beer glass. At a table near the window, 3 men in expensive suits were deep in conversation, their voices carrying the confidence of people accustomed to being heard. The one facing the bar, mid-40s with silver threading through carefully styled dark hair, gestured broadly as he spoke. The Riverside project is going to completely transform the waterfront, he was saying. We're talking luxury, residential, high-end retail, a boutique hotel. It's going to bring real money into that area. What's there now? One of his companions asked. Nothing worth keeping. Old warehouses, some industrial holdovers. We've already got the permits approved. Groundbreaking is scheduled for next month. Marcus, you always land on your feet, the third man said, raising his glass. Here's to another Hale Development success story. Marcus Hale accepted the toast with practiced humility that fooled no one. It's not luck. It's about knowing which doors to knock on and which palms to grease. This city runs on relationships, gentlemen. Never forget that. The door opened, bringing a gust of cool evening air and a figure that immediately commanded attention without seeming to try. Evelyn Ross moved through the bar like someone accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around her presence. She was tall, late 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a style that was elegant without being fussy. Her charcoal suit was expensive but understated, tailored to fit perfectly, cut to suggest power without advertising it. She carried a leather bag over one shoulder and wore the particular kind of exhaustion that came from making too many decisions and trusting too few people. She scanned the room with the efficiency of someone categorizing information, her gaze moving past the clusters of after-work drinkers, past the basketball game, past Marcus Hale's animated table, and landing, briefly but noticeably, on the man in flannel sitting alone at the bar. "Evelyn?" Marcus was already standing, waving her over. "We were just talking about Riverside. Come join us." She offered a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm good, Marcus. Long day. I think I'm just going to grab something and head out." "One drink. We're celebrating." "You're always celebrating something." "Exactly. Which means you should always join me." She hesitated, her professional instincts warring with genuine fatigue. The instincts won. They usually did. "One drink, then I'm gone." Marcus pulled out a chair with a flourish. "That's my partner, always keeping me honest." Evelyn set her bag down and settled into the seat, already regretting the decision. Marcus launched back into his description of the Riverside project, his voice rising with enthusiasm as he detailed the financial projections and the political maneuvering that had secured the necessary approvals. She'd heard it all before. She'd signed off on the permits herself. But she let him talk, making the appropriate sounds of interest while her attention drifted around the room. It landed again on the man at the bar. There was something about his stillness that drew her eye. In a room full of people performing relaxation, he actually seemed relaxed. While everyone else was managing their presentation, adjusting posture, monitoring volume, calculating responses, he was simply sitting, completely at ease with his own presence. She watched as a woman in business casual approached the bar near where he sat, ordered a drink, then deliberately shifted away from him, putting physical distance between herself and his worn clothing. The bartender, Danny himself, caught the movement and glanced at Caleb with something that might have been apologetic. Caleb noticed. She could tell by the slight shift in his shoulders the way his fingers moved fractionally on the beer glass, but his expression remained unchanged. No embarrassment, no anger, just acknowledgement of a fact that required no response. Earth to Evelyn. Marcus was looking at her expectantly. "I asked what you thought about the timeline." "Sorry. It's aggressive, but manageable if the permits hold." "They'll hold. I made sure of it." He leaned back with the satisfaction of someone who'd just confirmed his own competence. "The groundwork is already done. Literally. We've got the surveys, the soil tests, everything. This is going to be the smoothest project we've ever run." One of his companions, a lawyer Evelyn recognized from previous deals, cleared his throat. "What about the floodplain questions? I thought there was some concern about ancient history," Marcus interrupted. "Those reports were from decades ago, before modern engineering. We've got current data that shows we're completely fine. The city signed off on everything." Evelyn felt a small pulse of discomfort, but said nothing. She'd learned early in her career that there were times to push and times to stay quiet. This was Marcus's project. She was listed as a partner more for regulatory reasons than active involvement. Still, something about his certainty bothered her. Marcus was brilliant at relationships and terrible at details. He delegated well, trusted expensive consultants, and genuinely believed that confidence could override structural reality. Most of the time, it worked. Sometimes, it didn't. At the bar, Caleb finished his beer and signaled Danny for his check. The bartender approached with familiar ease. "Heading out, Cal?" "Yeah, Emma's got a science test tomorrow. Want to make sure she gets to bed on time." "How's she doing?" "Good, really good. She's got a presentation on ecosystems. Built this whole terrarium thing. I don't understand half of it, but she's excited." Danny smiled. "You're a good dad, man." "I just show up. She does the rest." Caleb pulled cash from his wallet, leaving enough to cover the beer and a generous tip. "See you next week." "You know it." As Caleb stood, sliding off the bar stool with the careful movement of someone whose back carried the memory of long days bent over engine blocks, the conversation at Marcus's table hit a lull. One of the men, slightly drunk and emboldened by alcohol, raised his voice. "Hey, buddy, you know there's a shelter 2 blocks down if you need a place tonight." The words cut through the ambient noise. Caleb paused, his hand still on the bar. He turned slowly, taking in the speaker. A man in his 50s, red-faced, grinning like he'd just delivered the world's best joke. For a moment, the two men just looked at each other. Then Caleb nodded once. "Appreciate the concern," he said, his voice quiet and even. "Have a good night." He moved toward the door without hurry, his gait unhurried but purposeful. The red-faced man laughed, looking around for validation. Seriously, did you see that guy? What's he doing in a place like this? Drinking a beer, Evelyn said, her voice cutting through the laughter with unexpected sharpness. Same as you. The table went quiet. Marcus shot her a look that asked what she was doing. She stood, picking up her bag. Actually, I'm going to pass on that drink. Like I said, long day. Evelyn, come on. Tom was just joking around. I know. She looked at Tom directly. That's the problem. She walked out before Marcus could respond, pushing through the door into the cool evening air. The street was quieter than the bar, the sound of traffic providing a low hum of white noise. She stood for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the dimmer light, feeling the tension in her shoulders start to unwind. Caleb was standing near the curb, keys in hand, looking at an old pickup truck that had clearly been repaired more times than replaced. The truck was clean, but ancient, late 90s, maybe early 2000s. The kind of vehicle that ran forever if you knew what you were doing and actually did the maintenance. She found herself walking toward him before she'd consciously decided to. Hey! He turned, showing neither surprise nor suspicion, just acknowledgement. Evening? I'm sorry about that. The guy inside. That was unnecessary. Caleb studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. You're the one who shut him down. So, thank you, but you didn't need to. Maybe not, but I wanted to. Fair enough. He opened the truck door and she caught a glimpse of the interior, clean, organized, a child's backpack on the passenger seat, a stack of school papers in a folder. You have a daughter, she said, the observation coming out before she could filter it. Emma. She's 9. Smart as hell and completely fearless. Gets that from her mother. He said it without sadness or bitterness, just fact. Is she? Died when Emma was 3. Car accident. Drunk driver ran a red light. He delivered the information the same way he delivered everything else, plainly, without decoration or request for sympathy. Evelyn felt the weight of the statement settle between them. I'm sorry. Me too. He climbed into the truck, then paused, looking back at her. You're the partner, right? Ross and Hale Development. She blinked, surprised he knew. Yes, Evelyn Ross. Caleb Moore. He offered his hand through the open door. His grip was firm, his palm calloused. I run Moore Auto Works over on 5th Street. We do fleet maintenance for some of the commercial buildings downtown. Small world. Smaller than most people think. He started the engine, which turned over smoothly despite the truck's age. Your partner talks loud, hard not to overhear. He does like an audience. Riverside Project sounds ambitious. It is. Caleb nodded slowly, and something in his expression shifted. Not judgment exactly, but consideration. Old industrial area. Used to do some work out there years back. Buildings were already struggling with foundation issues then. Rivers close, water tables high. Flooding was always a problem. Evelyn felt that pulse of discomfort again, stronger this time. You remember that area well? I remember what I saw, but I'm just a mechanic. He said it without self-deprecation or irony. Have a good night, Ms. Ross. He pulled away from the curb, the old truck merging smoothly into traffic and disappearing down the street. Evelyn stood on the sidewalk, watching the taillights fade, Marcus's confident voice echoing in her memory. Ancient history, modern engineering, everything signed off, and underneath it, quieter but persistent, foundation issues, water table, flooding. She walked to her own car, a sleek German sedan that cost more than Caleb's truck was worth 5 times over, and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. What was that about? Call me. She ignored it. Instead, she pulled up the files for the Riverside Project on her tablet, scrolling through permits and surveys and engineering reports that she'd signed off on weeks ago without reading in detail. Marcus was right. She was listed as a partner mostly for appearances to satisfy regulatory requirements about company structure. She trusted him to handle the details. She'd trusted him. Now, sitting in her car with Caleb Moore's words replaying in her mind, she started reading. The next morning, Caleb was under the hood of a 2015 Camry, replacing a timing belt, when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it, focused on threading the new belt through the pulleys with the careful precision the job required. Timing belts didn't allow for approximation. The phone buzzed again, then a third time. "Emma, can you grab that?" he called toward the small office area where his daughter was doing homework at the desk. "It says unknown number," she called back. "Let it go to voicemail." She appeared in the doorway of the service bay, backpack still on, looking at him with the serious expression she got when she was working through a problem. "Dad, what's a soil composition analysis?" He straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Where'd you hear that?" "Science class. Mrs. Patterson was talking about construction and how you have to test the ground before you build things. Is that what you meant last night when you said the Riverside buildings had foundation problems?" Caleb blinked. "Were you eavesdropping on my conversation?" "You were talking in the kitchen. I was doing homework at the table. That's not eavesdropping, that's just being present in a shared space." She delivered this with the flawless logic of a 9-year-old who'd already learned how to navigate her father's rules. "Fair point." He set down the rag and crouched to her level. "Foundation problems are when the ground under a building isn't stable enough to support the weight. If the soil is too soft or if there's too much water, the building can shift or sink over time. And that's bad. Very bad. Buildings need solid ground. It's like trying to build a Lego tower on a waterbed. Eventually, things are going to move in ways they're not supposed to." Emma processed this with the gravity it deserved. "So the buildings at Riverside are on a waterbed?" "I don't know for sure. I just remember that area had problems years ago. But I'm not an engineer, so what I remember might not matter anymore." "But you told that lady about it." "I mentioned it. That's different." "Why?" It was a simple question that required a complicated answer. Caleb considered his daughter, this brilliant, fearless kid who asked hard questions and expected real answers. She got that from her mother, the refusal to accept surface explanations, the need to understand not just what, but why. "Because," he said carefully, "if I know something that might be important, and I don't say anything, and then something bad happens, I have to live with that. I'd rather say something and be wrong than stay quiet and be right." Emma thought about this. "That makes sense." "I'm glad one of us thinks so." "Do you think the lady will check?" "I don't know, kiddo. That's up to her." "But you think she should?" "Yeah," Caleb admitted. "I think she should." Emma adjusted her backpack and headed back toward the office. "Okay, I'm going to finish my homework. Don't forget we have parent-teacher conferences next week. Already on the calendar. And I need new soccer cleats. My toes are cramped. Also on the calendar. You're very organized for someone who works with greasy engines all day." "That's how I stay organized. Everything in its place. Every place for everything." He returned to the Camry, but his mind wasn't entirely on the timing belt anymore. Evelyn Ross spent her Friday morning in meetings that felt increasingly pointless. Budget reviews for projects that were already approved. Status updates on timelines that hadn't changed. Conversations that could have been emails, held in conference rooms because physical presence implied importance. By 11, she was back in her office with the door closed, the Riverside files spread across her desk. She'd spent most of the previous night reading through them. Marcus was right that everything was signed off. Permits approved, inspections scheduled, financing secured. The project was greenlit on every level that mattered for moving forward. But Caleb was also right that the area had a history. The older reports, some dating back 15 years, detailed concerns about soil stability and seasonal flooding. The Riverside district sat in a natural basin where 3 old creek beds converged. Modern drainage had diverted much of the surface water, but the water table remained high, especially during heavy rain seasons. Several of the old warehouse buildings in the area showed signs of settling, cracked foundations, uneven floors, doors that no longer hung square in their frames. The modern reports acknowledged this history but dismissed it as resolved. New drainage systems, improved engineering techniques, deep foundation pilings that would reach bedrock. It all sounded reasonable. It also sounded like the kind of reasonable that got signed off on by people who wanted to believe everything would work because the alternative was expensive delays and difficult conversations. Evelyn picked up her phone and called the chief engineer on the project, a man named Richard Torres, who came highly recommended and charged accordingly. "Richard, it's Evelyn Ross. Do you have a few minutes?" For you, always. What's up? The Riverside Project. I'm looking at the soil reports and I have some questions about the mitigation strategies for the water table issues. There was a pause, not long, but noticeable. Those were all addressed in the Phase 2 analysis. The pilings will extend down to bedrock, and we've got a comprehensive drainage system designed to handle even 100-year flood events. I saw that. I'm wondering about the models you used. The projections seem optimistic compared to the historical data. Another pause. Evelyn, I'm not sure what you're getting at. We followed all standard protocols. The city approved everything. I know. I'm just doing my due diligence. This is Marcus's project. Have you talked to him about your concerns? The question landed with more weight than it should have. It was perfectly reasonable. Marcus was the lead partner. It made sense to discuss concerns with him. But the way Richard asked suggested something else. Why are you second-guessing work that's already approved? Why are you making trouble? I'm talking to you, Evelyn said, keeping her voice level. As the engineer of record, if I have questions about structural decisions, you're the appropriate person to answer them. Of course. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. Richard's tone shifted, becoming more formal. Look, if you want to schedule a full review meeting, I can pull together the complete analysis and walk you through every decision point. But I'm confident in the work. We didn't cut corners. I'm not suggesting you did. I'm asking questions. Fair enough? Send me a list of specific concerns and I'll address each one in writing. How's that? It was a reasonable offer. It was also a delay tactic. By the time Richard prepared written responses and she reviewed them and formulated follow-up questions, weeks could pass. And in that time, the pressure to move forward would build. The momentum would become harder to stop. That works, Evelyn said. I'll send them over by end of day. She hung up and immediately called Marcus. He answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the energy of someone in the middle of multiple conversations. Hey, I was just about to call you. We need to talk about last night. What was that exit about? I left because I was tired. Not everything is dramatic, Marcus. You basically called Tom an asshole in front of everyone. I implied he was being an asshole. There's a difference. Marcus laughed, the tension breaking. Fair distinction. Look, he was out of line. I told him so this morning. We good? We're fine. That's not why I'm calling. I want to talk about Riverside. The energy in his voice shifted. What about it? I've been reviewing the soil reports and the historical data on the area. There are some concerns I want to address before we break ground. Evelyn, we've been through this. Everything is signed off. Richard's team did a comprehensive analysis. The city approved it. We're ready to go. I know what's approved. I'm asking if we're confident it's right. Of course I'm confident. I wouldn't have pushed for approval if I wasn't. Have you personally reviewed the engineering reports? The complete ones, not just the summaries? Silence. Then, that's what I pay Richard for. He's one of the best structural engineers in the state. That's not an answer to my question. Evelyn, what is this really about? Did someone say something to you? She hesitated, knowing this was the moment that would shape the conversation. She could mention Caleb, explain his concerns, provide context for her questions, or she could keep her source separate and let the questions stand on their own merit. I reviewed the files and saw some discrepancies between the historical data and the current projections. I want to understand them before we move forward. We're scheduled to break ground in 3 weeks. If we start second-guessing engineering decisions now, we'll blow the timeline and the budget. If we build on unstable ground, we'll blow more than the timeline. That's why we hire experts, Marcus's voice rose, frustration breaking through. We pay people like Richard specifically so we don't have to become engineers ourselves. I trust the professionals, so should you. I do trust them. I also verify their work. Since when? You've never been this hands-on before. It was true. She'd always been more focused on the financial and regulatory side, leaving the technical details to specialists. But something about this project felt different. Maybe it was Caleb's quiet certainty. Maybe it was the way Richard had deflected her questions. Maybe it was just instinct built from years of watching confident people make expensive mistakes. Since now, she said, I'm scheduling a review meeting for Monday. Full engineering team, complete analysis, no summaries. I want to walk through every decision point. Evelyn, this is my name on the permits too, Marcus. If something goes wrong, it's my liability as much as yours. I'm doing my job. She could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, working through his response. Marcus was many things: charming, ambitious, sometimes reckless, but he wasn't stupid. He knew when to push and when to concede. Fine, Monday. But I'm telling you right now, you're not going to find anything. And when you don't, we move forward. Agreed? If the analysis holds up, absolutely. Good. Now, can we please get back to work? I've got 3 other calls waiting. He hung up before she could respond. Evelyn set down her phone and looked out her office window at the city skyline. Steel and glass and concrete reaching toward the sky, each building a monument to someone's confidence that the ground beneath it would hold. Most of the time, it did, but not always. Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. Danny's tonight? The usual? She smiled despite herself. The usual. Thursday nights at Danny's bar had somehow become routine, a small ritual of decompression in a life that rarely allowed for predictable patterns. She replied, "See you there at 7. When Evelyn walked into Danny's that evening, Caleb was already at the bar in the same spot, same flannel shirt, same quiet presence that seemed to occupy space without demanding it. She surprised herself by walking directly to him instead of finding a separate table. "This seat taken?" He looked up, showing neither surprise nor performance of casualness, just acknowledgement. "It's all yours." She settled onto the bar stool, setting her bag on the floor. Danny appeared immediately, his smile genuine. "Evelyn, good to see you. The usual? Please? And another for Cal?" Caleb glanced at his half-empty glass. "Sure. Thanks, Danny." They sat in comfortable silence while Danny poured their drinks, a craft IPA for Evelyn, a domestic lager for Caleb. The bar was busy but not crowded, the Thursday evening energy familiar and somehow soothing. "So," Evelyn said, accepting her glass, "I spent today reading soil composition reports and historical flood data for the Riverside District." Caleb's expression didn't change, but she caught the slight shift in his posture that suggested attention. "Find anything interesting?" "Maybe. The current analysis says everything's fine. The historical data suggests everything's fine until it isn't. That's usually how it works. The engineer is confident. My partner is confident. The city is confident. But you're not." It wasn't a question. She appreciated that he didn't frame it as doubt or weakness, just observation. "I want to be," she admitted. "It would be much easier if I was." Caleb took a drink, considering his words. "I worked on a retrofit project out there about 8 years ago. Old manufacturing building that was being converted to loft apartments. Beautiful bones, good structure, but the foundation was shifting. We had to bring in structural engineers, shore everything up, add new supports. It worked, but it was expensive and complicated." "What caused the shifting?" "Water. The drainage system couldn't handle heavy rains, and the soil underneath was more clay than anyone realized. Clay expands when it gets wet, contracts when it dries. Over time, that cycle created movement, small movements, barely noticeable year to year, but they add up." "Did the building survive?" "Yeah, but only because the owner caught it early and was willing to invest in fixing it properly. If he'd ignored it or tried to patch it with surface solutions, eventually the whole thing would have failed." Evelyn absorbed this, matching it against the reports she'd read. The current Riverside analysis accounts for drainage. They've got a comprehensive system designed. "I'm sure they do. Engineering has come a long way, but there's a difference between accounting for drainage and accounting for decades of water saturation in soil that might already be compromised. The pilings go to bedrock. That helps. But if the soil around the piling shifts, you can get what they call negative skin friction. Basically, the settling soil pulls down on the pilings instead of the pilings supporting the structure. It's rare, but it happens, especially in areas with high water tables and unstable soil." She stared at him. "How do you know this?" "I read. I pay attention. And I've seen enough buildings fail to know that the distance between engineered to code and actually stable can sometimes be wider than people want to admit." He met her gaze directly. "But like I said before, I'm just a mechanic. What I think doesn't change what's true." What you think might be the only honest perspective I've gotten all week. Caleb smiled, a small expression that softened the weathered lines of his face. Honesty's easier when you don't have money on the line. Is that why you're telling me this? I'm telling you because you asked, and because you seem like someone who'd rather know than pretend. He paused. Also, I have a daughter who's going to grow up in this city. I'd prefer the building she lives and works in to be structurally sound. That's a good motivation. Only one I've got. They drank in silence for a moment, the noise of the bar filling the space around them, conversations and laughter and the clink of glasses, all of it familiar and undemanding. I'm scheduling a review meeting for Monday, Evelyn said. Full engineering analysis, every decision point. If there's a problem, I'm going to find it. And if there isn't, then I'll look paranoid and overly cautious, and Marcus will never let me forget it. But you'll know. Yes, I'll know. Caleb raised his glass slightly. That's worth something. She clinked her glass against his, surprised by how much she appreciated his presence. This man who asked for nothing, performed nothing, and somehow managed to be more real than anyone else in her professional life. The door opened, and Marcus Hale walked in with 2 associates, their voices carrying across the room with the particular volume of people accustomed to being heard. He spotted Evelyn at the bar, and his expression shifted through several emotions too quickly to categorize. "Evelyn, I didn't know you'd be here." He approached with his usual confidence, then noticed who she was sitting with. His stride faltered just slightly. "And you're having a drink with Caleb Moore," Caleb supplied, extending his hand. "We met the other night, sort of." Marcus took the hand automatically, his professional instincts overriding his confusion. "Right, the shelter comment. Tom apologized for that, by the way." "No apology necessary. It was just words." Still, he was out of line. Marcus turned back to Evelyn, clearly trying to understand the situation. "So you two know each other?" "We're getting acquainted," Evelyn said smoothly. Caleb was just explaining some of the history of the Riverside district. Turns out he's worked on several building projects in that area. The temperature in Marcus's expression dropped several degrees. "Is that so?" "It is," Caleb confirmed, his tone unchanged. "Used to do a lot of commercial maintenance work before I focused on the auto shop full-time." "How interesting." Marcus's smile had taken on a sharp edge. "And what exactly were you telling my partner about our project?" "Just history. What I've seen over the years. She mentioned she's doing a review, figured my observations might provide some context." "Context?" Marcus repeated the word like it tasted wrong. "From someone with what kind of engineering background?" "None at all. Just experience and observation." "Right. So, respectfully, probably not the most reliable source for technical assessment of a multi-million-dollar development project." The dismissal was smooth and absolute. Caleb accepted it with the same equanimity he'd shown to everything else. No defensiveness, no embarrassment, just acknowledgement of Marcus's perspective. "Probably not," he agreed. Evelyn felt something sharp move through her chest. Caleb's observations are consistent with the historical data in the old reports, the ones from before we had modern engineering solutions to sell. Marcus's attention snapped to her. "We're not doing this here." "Doing what?" "Having a conversation about structural concerns." "We're having a review meeting Monday, with actual engineers, with credentials and professional liability insurance. Until then, I'd appreciate it if you didn't let random strangers influence your thinking on matters they're not qualified to assess." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Caleb stood, pulling cash from his wallet with calm efficiency. "I should head out anyway. Emma's got soccer practice in the morning." He laid bills on the bar, enough to cover both drinks and a generous tip. "Ms. Ross, I hope your review goes well. Mr. Hale, good luck with your project." He walked out without hurry, leaving a silence that felt louder than the ambient noise of the bar. Marcus waited until the door closed. "What the hell was that?" "That was me having a drink with someone who answered my questions honestly." "He's a mechanic, Evelyn, with no expertise in structural engineering, no understanding of modern construction techniques, and apparently a lot of opinions about projects he knows nothing about. He knows the area. He's seen what happens when buildings are constructed on unstable ground. And we've hired experts who know how to build on any ground, including unstable ground. That's literally their job." Then the review Monday should be easy. The analysis will hold up and we'll move forward. Marcus studied her with an expression she couldn't quite read, frustration mixed with something else. Concern, maybe, or calculation. This isn't like you, he said finally. The cautious thing, the second guessing. What's really going on? It was a good question. Evelyn wasn't sure she knew the answer. Maybe I'm tired of signing off on things I don't fully understand. Maybe I'm realizing that trust without verification is just another word for negligence. She picked up her glass. Or maybe I'm just having a bad week and being paranoid. Monday will tell us which. Marcus nodded slowly. Okay, Monday. Full transparency, complete analysis, and then we move forward. If the analysis holds. It will. He said it with absolute certainty, the same certainty he brought to every project, every deal, every decision. It was one of his greatest strengths, and she was starting to suspect, possibly his greatest weakness. She finished her drink in silence while Marcus joined his associates at another table, their conversation resuming with forced enthusiasm. Through the window, she could see Caleb's old truck pulling away from the curb, taillights disappearing into the evening traffic. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. This is Danny. Cal asked me to pass along his number in case you have more questions about Riverside. No pressure. He just figured you might want someone to talk to who doesn't have money on the line. Below it, a phone number. Evelyn saved the contact, finished her drink, and headed home to prepare for a meeting that would either prove her concerns unfounded or change everything. Either way, by Monday evening, she'd know. The weekend passed with the slow weight of anticipation. Evelyn spent Saturday afternoon in her home office, surrounded by printed reports and highlighted passages that painted contradictory pictures of the same piece of ground. Sunday morning, she went for a run along the river, trying to clear her mind, but found herself studying the waterline, noting how high it sat against the concrete embankments, wondering how much higher it rose during heavy rains. By Sunday evening, she'd read through the Riverside files 3 more times and compiled a list of 17 specific questions that needed answers before she'd feel comfortable moving forward. Monday morning arrived with overcast skies and the promise of rain. Evelyn arrived at the office early, before the administrative staff, and used the quiet to review her notes one final time. The engineering review meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the main conference room. Richard Torres would be there with his team, Marcus would be there with his certainty, and she would be there with her questions, hoping they'd either be answered satisfactorily or prove prescient. At 9:30, her assistant knocked on the door frame. They're setting up in the conference room. Richard's team brought physical models and some kind of digital presentation. It looks very official. I'm sure it is. Evelyn gathered her materials. Thanks, Jennifer. Ms. Ross? Jennifer hesitated at the door. For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. Asking questions. My dad's a contractor, and he always says the most expensive mistakes are the ones people were too proud to prevent. Evelyn smiled. Your dad sounds smart. He is. Also stubborn. But I guess those things go together sometimes. The conference room had been transformed into a presentation space. A scale model of the Riverside development sat on the main table, complete with tiny trees and miniature buildings rendered in precise detail. 2 large monitors displayed technical schematics and soil composition maps. Richard Torres stood near the windows, talking quietly with 2 younger engineers who carried themselves with the particular blend of competence and deference that marked people who knew their expertise was valuable but not yet proven. Marcus was already seated at the head of the table, his posture relaxed but his attention focused. He nodded to Evelyn as she entered. Morning, ready for this? As ready as I'll ever be. Good. Let's make it productive. He turned to Richard. Whenever you're ready. Richard stepped to the front of the room, his presentation materials arranged with the careful organization of someone who'd anticipated this moment and prepared accordingly. He was in his mid-40s, with graying temples, and the build of someone who'd once been athletic, but now spent most of his time in offices. His suit was expensive without being flashy, his demeanor professional without being cold. Thank you all for making time for this review, he began. I understand there are some questions about the structural approach for the Riverside project, and I want to address those comprehensively. My goal today is to walk you through every major decision point in our analysis and explain the engineering rationale behind each one. He clicked a remote, and the first monitor displayed a satellite image of the Riverside District, the old warehouses and industrial buildings clearly visible along the curved path of the river. Let's start with context. The Riverside District occupies approximately 42 acres in what was historically a light industrial and warehouse zone. The area sits in a natural basin formed by the convergence of three historical creek beds that were diverted and channeled underground during the city's expansion in the 1960s. Another click. The image overlaid with transparent blue lines showing the old creek paths and the modern drainage system. The current drainage infrastructure was designed to handle normal seasonal variation in water flow. However, as we all know, historical data shows occasional flooding during exceptional rain events, particularly in the 1990s and early 2000s. Evelyn made a note. Richard noticed. Those flooding events were significant in our analysis, he continued. We didn't dismiss the historical data. We used it to inform our engineering approach. The question wasn't whether the area had water management challenges. It clearly did. The question was whether modern engineering could adequately address those challenges. Our conclusion, after extensive analysis, is yes. He advanced to the next slide, which showed a cross-section of the proposed building foundations. Our approach uses deep pile foundations extending to bedrock at an average depth of 60 feet. These pilings are designed to support the structural load independent of the surrounding soil conditions. Even if the upper soil layers experience some movement due to water saturation, the building load is transferred directly to stable bedrock. One of the younger engineers, a woman with dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, stepped forward with a pointer. Additionally, we've designed a comprehensive subsurface drainage system that will actively manage groundwater levels around the foundation zone. The system includes perforated drainage pipes, gravel beds, and pump stations that can remove excess water before it accumulates to problematic levels. Richard nodded his approval. The combination of bedrock-anchored pilings and active water management creates a foundation system that's significantly more robust than what existed in the older buildings in the area. Those buildings used shallow foundations, concrete pads or short pilings that terminated in the upper soil layers. They were vulnerable to the exact problems Mr. Moore mentioned in his conversations with Ms. Ross. The casual mention of Caleb's name landed with deliberate weight. Richard's tone remained professional, but the message was clear. We know where your concerns originated, and we're addressing them. Marcus leaned back in his chair, satisfaction evident in his posture. Evelyn kept her expression neutral. Walk me through the soil composition analysis, she said. The current report shows significantly different moisture content projections than the historical surveys. What accounts for that discrepancy? Richard pulled up a new slide showing soil boring data from multiple locations across the site. Good question. The historical surveys were conducted during or shortly after periods of heavy rainfall, which naturally showed higher moisture content. Our surveys were conducted over an 18-month period to capture seasonal variation. We found that moisture content varies considerably depending on recent precipitation, but the range of variation is well within the tolerance of our engineering approach. What about long-term saturation? The historical data suggests the clay layers in the area retain water for extended periods, creating cumulative effects over years rather than seasons. That's true of the upper clay layers, the female engineer responded, but our drainage system is specifically designed to interrupt that accumulation cycle. By actively removing water before it can saturate the clay, we prevent the expansion and contraction cycles that cause foundation movement. Evelyn wrote another note. And if the drainage system fails? If pumps malfunction or pipes become blocked? Richard didn't hesitate. We've designed redundancy into the system. Multiple pump stations, backup power, regular maintenance protocols. But even in a worst-case scenario where the drainage system completely failed, the deep pilings would still support the structural load. The building wouldn't be at risk of collapse. You might see some minor settling in surrounding hardscape elements, sidewalks, parking areas, but the primary structures would remain stable. How minor is minor? Millimeters over years, not inches over months. Marcus spoke up. Evelyn, I appreciate the thoroughness, but this is exactly what I told you. Richard's team has thought through every scenario. They've built in redundancy and safety margins that go well beyond code requirements. This is solid engineering. She ignored him, keeping her attention on Richard. Show me the flood modeling. I want to see the projections for 100-year and 500-year events. The presentation shifted to hydrological models, complex simulations showing water flow patterns under various rainfall scenarios. Richard walked her through each one methodically, explaining how the drainage system would handle increasing water volumes where overflow would be directed, what safety margins existed at each level of severity. It was impressive work, thorough, detailed, professionally executed, the kind of analysis that should have answered every question and eliminated every concern. But something still bothered her. These models assume the drainage infrastructure remains functional, she said. What if it doesn't? What if climate change means your 100-year storm becomes a 20-year storm? What if the city's upstream water management fails and suddenly you're dealing with volumes you didn't plan for? Richard's expression tightened slightly. Ms. Ross, with respect, at some point we have to work with reasonable projections rather than catastrophic scenarios. If we tried to engineer for every possible worst-case combination of events, nothing would ever get built. I'm not asking you to engineer for every possibility. I'm asking what happens if your assumptions are wrong. Then we adapt. Buildings aren't static. They can be reinforced. Drainage can be upgraded. Systems can be improved. But you can't let theoretical future problems prevent practical current solutions. It was a reasonable answer. It was also the same logic that had preceded every engineering failure she'd ever read about. Assumptions that held until they didn't. Projections that worked until they failed. Confidence that proved misplaced only in hindsight. Marcus stood, moving to the window with the careful casualness of someone redirecting a conversation. I think what Richard is trying to say, diplomatically, is that we've done our due diligence. Multiple times. The city has reviewed and approved this approach. The financing team has vetted it. Our insurance carriers have signed off. At a certain point, additional questions become obstacles rather than safeguards, or they become the difference between a successful project and a preventable disaster, Evelyn countered. Based on what evidence? The concerns of a mechanic who worked on a building retrofit 8 years ago? The room went very quiet. Richard and his team suddenly found great interest in their notes. Evelyn met Marcus's gaze directly. Based on historical data that shows this area has persistent water management problems, based on the fact that the conditions causing those problems haven't fundamentally changed, just been temporarily mitigated, based on the reality that our entire approach depends on active systems continuing to function as designed over decades. That's true of every building in this city, Marcus said. Every structure depends on maintenance, on systems functioning, on people doing their jobs. That's not a reason to stop building. It's a reason to build well, which we are doing. Are we? Or are we building confidently and hoping that's the same thing? Marcus's jaw tightened. What do you want, Evelyn? Specifically, do you want more surveys, more models, more time? Because I need to know if this is about actual engineering concerns or if this is about something else. What else would it be about? I don't know. You tell me. You've never been this involved in the technical side before. You've never second-guessed our engineering teams. You've certainly never let casual conversations with strangers influence multi-million-dollar decisions. So either you've fundamentally changed your approach to partnership or something else is going on. Which is it? The accusation hung in the air, sharp and unavoidable. Evelyn felt the weight of everyone's attention, the question embedded in their silence. Was this about engineering or about something else? Was this due diligence or second-guessing? Professional caution or personal doubt? She thought about Caleb sitting at that bar, completely unbothered by mockery or dismissal, offering information without agenda or performance. She thought about the quiet certainty in his voice when he'd described watching buildings fail, the matter-of-fact way he'd prioritized his daughter's safety over professional courtesy. She thought about how easily she'd trusted Marcus's confidence before, how comfortable it had been to let experts handle details while she focused on the parts of the business she understood better. I think, she said carefully, that I've been a passive partner in areas where I should have been active. I think I've trusted delegation when I should have demanded verification. And I think the fact that I'm asking these questions now instead of 3 months ago is exactly why they need to be asked. Richard cleared his throat diplomatically. If it would help, we could arrange a site visit, walk the actual location, show you the soil boring sites, explain the engineering approach and context. Sometimes seeing the physical space makes the technical analysis clearer. It was an olive branch, professionally offered. Evelyn considered it. That would help, she said. When can we arrange it? This afternoon, if you're available. The site is currently in pre-construction staging, so it's accessible and safe. Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it, clearly recalculating his approach. Fine. Site visit this afternoon. Richard, pull together whatever you need to demonstrate the foundation approach. Evelyn, I hope this will put your concerns to rest. If the engineering is as solid as you say, it will. The meeting broke up with the kind of professional courtesy that masked genuine tension. Richard and his team began packing up their materials, discussing logistics for the site visit in low voices. Marcus lingered near the window, his attention apparently on the street below, but his posture suggesting he was very much aware of Evelyn's presence. She gathered her notes, preparing to return to her office, when Marcus spoke without turning around. I'm trying to understand this, Evelyn. I really am. But from where I'm standing, it looks like you're sabotaging a project we've both invested heavily in based on the opinions of someone with no credentials and no stake in the outcome. Caleb has the same stake everyone has. He lives in this city. He wants buildings to be safe. Noble sentiment doesn't make him an engineer. No, but it doesn't make him wrong either. Marcus finally turned, his expression unusually serious. Do you trust me? The question caught her off guard. What? Simple question. After everything we've built together, all the projects we've completed successfully, all the decisions we've made, do you trust my judgment? It wasn't simple at all. Trust wasn't binary. She trusted Marcus's instincts about deals, his ability to navigate political complexity, his talent for seeing opportunities others missed. But did she trust his judgment when it conflicted with technical concerns he didn't fully understand? Did she trust his confidence when it might be overriding necessary caution? I trust that you believe in this project, she said. I trust that you've relied on experts you consider competent. But trust doesn't mean I stop asking questions. It means something, though. It has to. Otherwise, we're not partners. We're just two people who happen to share a company name. He walked out before she could respond, leaving her alone in the conference room with the scale model of Riverside. Its tiny, perfect buildings sitting on their tiny, perfect foundation, everything engineered to exact specifications that would work flawlessly as long as every assumption held true. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, though she recognized it from the contact Danny had sent. Hope your meeting went well. No pressure, but if you end up at the site this afternoon and want a second set of eyes, I'm available. Emma has art class until 5, so I've got some free time. Caleb. She stared at the message, considering implications and optics, and what it would mean to bring an unaffiliated mechanic to a professional engineering site review. Then she thought about how every person with credentials and financial interest had given her the same reassurances, the same confidence, the same reasons why her concerns were unfounded. She texted back, site visit at 2 p.m. at. Meet me at the Riverside location if you can make it. His response came quickly. I'll be there. The Riverside district sat on the eastern edge of downtown, where the city's polished commercial core gave way to older industrial zones that had seen better days. The area was in transition. Some buildings had been renovated into trendy loft spaces and artisan workshops. Others still stood empty with broken windows and faded signage advertising companies that no longer existed. The development site itself occupied a large rectangular lot that had been cleared of its previous structures, leaving behind only concrete foundations and the geometric shadows of buildings long demolished. A chain-link fence surrounded the perimeter, marked with signs announcing the future Riverside luxury development and warning of active construction zones. Evelyn arrived at 1:50, parking her sedan near the site office trailer that served as the temporary headquarters for the project team. Richard's truck was already there, along with a commercial van that presumably carried equipment and materials for the demonstration. Caleb's old pickup pulled in just as she was getting out of her car. He stepped out wearing the same work boots and a different flannel shirt, gray and black this time, but similarly worn. He carried a small notebook and had reading glasses tucked into his breast pocket. The glasses surprised her. She realized she'd never seen him read anything, had unconsciously assumed he was the type who worked with his hands because he wasn't comfortable with abstract information. Another assumption proven wrong. "Thanks for coming," she said. "Thanks for the invitation. I wasn't sure if you'd actually want me here." Neither was I, honestly. But I figured if I'm going to make a decision that might kill a multi-million-dollar project, I should at least make sure I'm not missing something obvious. And you think I might see the obvious thing? I think you don't have any reason to miss it. He nodded, understanding the distinction. "Where's your partner?" Marcus decided his presence wasn't necessary. Or productive. Possibly both. "Probably smart. I don't think he likes me much." "You questioned his project. He doesn't like anyone who does that." Richard appeared from around the site trailer, his professional smile firmly in place. He saw Caleb in his stride hitched slightly, but he recovered smoothly. "Ms. Ross, good to see you. We're all set up to walk the perimeter and discuss the Foundation approach." His gaze shifted to Caleb. "I wasn't aware we'd have additional participants." "Mr. Moore has experience with building projects in this area. I thought his perspective might be useful." "Of course. Though I should mention that site visits typically require proper safety gear and liability waivers." Caleb pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "Brought my own waiver. Used to do commercial work, so I'm familiar with the requirements. And I've got boots and a hard hat in the truck if we're going into any active zones." Richard's smile became slightly fixed. "Well then, let's get started." They walked the site perimeter, Richard explaining the planned foundation layout with the aid of stakes and markers that indicated where pilings would be driven. His two engineers had set up a portable soil boring rig at one location, demonstrating how they'd extracted samples from various depths. "The boring process gives us a vertical profile of soil composition," Richard explained, gesturing to a clear cylinder containing layered earth. "You can see the different strata here, topsoil, then clay, then sand and gravel layers, and eventually we hit bedrock at about 62 feet at this location." Caleb crouched next to the sample, studying it with quiet attention. "What's the moisture content in the clay layer?" "Currently about 18% by weight, well within normal range." "And during the rainy season?" "Our seasonal samples showed variation between 15 and 23%. The historical surveys showed peaks around 35% in some locations." Richard's expression tightened. "After extended rainfall. Those were exceptional events, not representative of normal conditions. But they happened, which means they can happen again. Which is why our drainage system is designed to prevent that level of saturation." Caleb stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "Can you show me where the drainage outflow goes?" Richard led them to the western edge of the site, where the land sloped gently toward the river. "The subsurface drainage system will collect water through a network of perforated pipes and direct it to 3 main pump stations. Those stations will transfer water to the city's storm sewer system, which empties into the river downstream. And if the storm sewers are already at capacity, which happens pretty regularly during heavy rains, the pump stations have holding capacity to manage temporary backups. Plus, we have overflow channels that can direct excess water to the river directly if necessary, across ground that's already saturated, through engineered channels designed for that purpose." Evelyn watched the exchange with growing unease. Both men were being perfectly professional, but underneath the courtesy was a fundamental disagreement about what constituted acceptable risk. Richard saw a well-engineered system with multiple redundancies. Caleb saw a complex arrangement of elements that all had to work correctly for the whole to function as intended. They walked to the northern section of the site, where the ground showed visible unevenness, subtle rises and depressions that suggested the land beneath wasn't entirely stable. "What's causing that variation?" Evelyn asked. "Historical settling from the old buildings that used to be here," Richard explained. "Once we excavate for the new foundations, we'll remove the compromised upper soil layers and replace them with properly compacted fill. The building load will be entirely on the deep pilings, so surface variations won't affect structural integrity." Caleb knelt, running his hand over the ground. "How deep is the water table here currently?" One of the younger engineers checked a tablet. "Our most recent measurement showed approximately 8 feet below surface. And during the rainy season, we've measured it as high as 4 feet below surface." "So you're excavating into ground that's seasonally saturated, installing a drainage system that depends on pumps and pipes staying clear, then building on pilings that extend through 60 feet of variable soil composition to reach bedrock that you're confident is stable and continuous. Richard's patience was clearly wearing thin. That's a deliberately pessimistic characterization of sound engineering practice. It's just a description of what you're doing. Whether it's pessimistic depends on whether it works. It will work. We've modeled every scenario, built in safety margins that exceed industry standards, and designed redundancy into every critical system. Until you can't anymore. Until the thing that fails is something you didn't model or didn't think was critical or assumed would be maintained but wasn't. Mr. Moore, I appreciate your perspective, but this kind of worst-case thinking isn't productive. If we tried to engineer for every possible failure scenario, we'd never build anything. Or you'd build things that lasted longer than their warranty periods. The tension finally broke into open conflict. Richard turned to Evelyn, his professional courtesy giving way to frank frustration. Ms. Ross, I need to be direct. I understand your desire for thoroughness, but we're at a point where additional questions aren't improving the project. They're just delaying it. We've conducted extensive analysis, provided comprehensive documentation, and designed a foundation system that meets or exceeds every applicable standard. If that's not sufficient, then I need to know what would be, because I'm not sure such a standard exists. It was a fair challenge. Evelyn recognized that she was in danger of crossing the line from diligence into paralysis, from healthy skepticism into obstruction based on fears that could never be fully eliminated. But she also recognized the pattern Richard was following, the same pattern that preceded every engineering failure that later seemed obvious in hindsight. The assumptions presented as facts, the models treated as reality. The confidence that silenced reasonable doubt until silence became complicity. She looked at Caleb, who was studying the ground with an expression of deep concentration, apparently oblivious to the tension his questions had created. "What do you see?" she asked him. He glanced up, surprised to be addressed directly. "Honestly?" "Honestly." He stood, brushing off his knees, then gestured to the surrounding area. "I see a lot of smart engineering designed to solve known problems. The pilings will work if the bedrock is where you think it is and as stable as you assume. The drainage will work if it's maintained properly and the city's infrastructure can handle the load, and climate patterns don't shift enough to overwhelm your design capacity. The whole system will work if every component works and every assumption holds. And if they don't? Then you'll have expensive problems that start small and get bigger until someone with less to lose than the people who built this decides they can't be ignored anymore." He met her gaze directly. "Look, I'm not saying this is bad engineering. It might be great engineering, but great engineering applied to wrong assumptions still fails. And the only way to know if your assumptions are wrong is to test them against reality, which you can't do until after you've built the thing." Richard made a sound of exasperation. That's literally the definition of engineering, making informed decisions based on incomplete information. We can't know the future. We can only plan for it as best we understand it. "I know," Caleb said simply. "That's why I'm not an engineer. Too much responsibility for too many things I can't control." Evelyn walked to the edge of the site, looking out over the area that would soon hold hundreds of residents in buildings designed to stand for decades. The river was visible in the distance, its surface gray under the overcast sky, moving with the patient inevitability of water that had shaped this landscape long before humans decided to build on it. She pulled out her phone and called Marcus. He answered immediately. "Please tell me you're done questioning basic engineering principles. I need you to be honest with me about something." His tone shifted. "Okay. If this project fails, if the foundations fail, if the buildings settle, if there's structural damage, what happens to the company?" "It won't fail." "But if it does?" Silence. Then, "It would be catastrophic. Between the construction costs, the legal liability, the reputation damage, it would probably destroy us, both of us. And if we delay? If we take more time to verify, to add additional safety measures, to redesign with more conservative assumptions? We lose the financing. The permits expire. The political support evaporates. The opportunity dies. And we've spent millions for nothing. So we're locked in. Move forward and hope we're right, or pull back and guarantee we lose. That's business, Evelyn. Every major decision involves risk. The question isn't whether there's risk, there always is. The question is whether the risk is acceptable given the potential reward. And you think it is. I know it is. Richard's team is solid. The engineering is sound. Your concerns, while understandable, aren't supported by technical analysis. At some point, you have to trust the expertise we're paying for. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision settling onto her shoulders. And if I can't, then you need to decide if you're my partner or my obstacle. The line went dead. Evelyn stood with the phone in her hand, watching the river, thinking about water tables and soil composition and buildings designed to carry weight they might not be able to bear. Thinking about confidence and caution and the difference between engineering for reality versus engineering for hope. Richard approached carefully. Ms. Ross, I don't mean to pressure you, but I need to know how to proceed. Do we move forward with the scheduled timeline, or are we putting the project on hold? Before she could answer, Caleb spoke from where he'd been quietly examining the ground near one of the boring sites. Ms. Ross, could you come look at this? She walked over. He was crouched next to a spot where recent rain had created a small depression, water pooling in a space no more than a few inches across. What am I looking at? The way the water is sitting here. It should have drained by now. The rain stopped hours ago. But it's not draining. It's just sitting. So the surface drainage is poor. That's why we're installing the subsurface system. Maybe. Or maybe it's sitting because there's nowhere for it to go. Because the soil underneath is already saturated and there's no capacity for more water. He looked up at her. I could be wrong. This could be just a surface depression with clay underneath creating a temporary pool. But it could also be exactly what I saw 8 years ago at that retrofit project. Ground that looked fine until you started digging and realized the water table was higher than anyone expected. Richard knelt down, examining the pool with visible skepticism. One small puddle doesn't indicate widespread saturation. There are dozens of variables that could create localized drainage issues. True, Caleb agreed, which is why you might want to do additional boring tests in this area, just to be sure. We've already done extensive soil analysis across the entire site. In this specific location, Richard checked his tablet, scrolling through data. We have boring results from approximately 40 feet north of here and 30 feet south. Standard grid spacing for a site this size. And what did those results show for water table depth? 7 to 9 feet, consistent with our overall findings. So you don't have specific data for this exact location? No, because we don't need data for every square foot of the site. We sample according to professional standards that provide statistically valid representation of subsurface conditions. Caleb nodded, accepting this. And those standards have never missed anything important. Not never, but the probability of a significant variation existing in an unmeasured location is very low. Low probability, but not zero. Nothing in engineering is zero probability, Mr. Moore. We work with acceptable risk, not absolute certainty. Evelyn stared at the small pool of water, this trivial little puddle that might mean nothing or might mean everything. She thought about acceptable risk and absolute certainty and the difference between the two. She thought about Marcus's confidence and Richard's expertise and Caleb's quiet insistence on verification. She thought about buildings full of people who would never know how close the calculations had been or what assumptions they were trusting every time they walked through a door. Do an additional boring test here, she said, right at this location. Richard's expression shifted through several emotions before settling on professional patience. Ms. Ross, with all respect, that's going to delay the schedule and add unnecessary costs to do the test. Today. If it shows the same results as your grid sampling, we move forward on schedule, and I'll personally apologize for wasting everyone's time. But if it shows something different, something your statistical sampling missed, then we redesign before we build. Evelyn, Richard started. Those are my terms, non-negotiable. Richard looked at his engineers who were carefully not making eye contact. Fine. We'll set up the boring rig. It'll take a few hours to reach meaningful depth. You'll have preliminary results by end of day. Thank you. He walked away to coordinate with his team, his posture radiating suppressed frustration. Caleb stood, brushing off his hands. You know there's a good chance that test will come back normal, that I'm wrong, and this is just a surface drainage issue. I know. And if it does, you're going to look overly cautious at best, paranoid at worst. Your partner already thinks you're undermining the project. This isn't going to help. I know that too. So why do it? She met his gaze, this mechanic with no credentials and no stake except the honest desire to see buildings stay standing. Because if you're right, and I ignored it, I couldn't live with what comes after. And if you're wrong and I checked anyway, all I lose is some credibility and some money. Those are acceptable costs for sleep at night. He smiled, a small expression of genuine respect. That's a good answer. They stood together watching Richard's team set up the boring rig, the machine's diesel engine rumbling to life as they positioned it over the small puddle that had become the most consequential patch of ground in the city. Your daughter, Evelyn said. Emma, what does she think about all this? I haven't told her the details. She's 9. She doesn't need to worry about building foundations and professional conflicts, but she knows you're involved in something. She knows I'm trying to help make sure buildings are safe. That's enough. Does she worry about you? About the fact that you're a single parent, carrying all that responsibility alone? Caleb considered the question thoughtfully. I don't think so. I've tried to build her life so it feels stable even though it's just the two of us. Routines help. Showing up helps. Being honest about what I know and what I don't helps. He paused. She's a lot stronger than people give her credit for, than I sometimes give her credit for. She gets that from you. She gets it from surviving something terrible and learning she could handle it. I just try not to get in her way. The boring rig began its work, the drill bit cutting into the earth with mechanical precision, pulling up soil in measured intervals that Richard's team carefully documented and tested. Evelyn's phone buzzed with texts from Marcus, first asking for updates, then expressing frustration, then finally going silent in a way that felt more ominous than the questions. The afternoon wore on. The drill went deeper, and Evelyn stood with Caleb Moore, watching them excavate truth from ground that might prove either one of them right and the other foolish, but would at least provide the certainty needed to move forward with clear conscience rather than hoped-for confidence. Whatever they found, she'd know, and knowing, she could finally decide. The drill reached 40 feet just as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the construction site. Richard's team worked with methodical efficiency, extracting core samples at regular intervals and documenting each layer with photographs and measurements. Evelyn had moved to the site office trailer to take calls and answer increasingly terse messages from Marcus, while Caleb remained near the boring rig, watching the process with the patient attention of someone who understood that truth emerged slowly from careful work. By the time the drill hit 50 feet, one of Richard's engineers, the woman with dark hair whose name Evelyn had learned was Dr. Sarah Chen, began showing visible concern. She'd been testing each soil sample as it came up, making notes on her tablet with increasingly frequent pauses to double-check her readings. Richard noticed. Problem, Sarah? I'm seeing higher moisture content than expected. Starting around 38 feet, the clay layer is showing saturation levels closer to the historical data than our grid samples indicated. How much higher? 28 to 31%, and it's consistent across the last 3 samples. Richard moved to examine the data himself, his professional composure intact, but his movements carrying new tension. Could be localized variation. We won't know if it's significant until we reach bedrock and can assess the full profile. Agreed. But Richard, if this saturation extends laterally across any significant portion of the site, let's not speculate until we have complete data. Caleb caught Evelyn's eye as she emerged from the trailer. She walked over, reading the situation from body language before anyone spoke. What did you find? Sarah looked to Richard, who nodded permission. The soil at this location is showing significantly higher moisture content than our grid sampling indicated. We need to reach bedrock to understand the full implications, but preliminary readings suggest this area may have subsurface water saturation that our initial survey didn't detect. Meaning Mr. Moore's concerns about persistent water retention in the clay layers appear to be valid, at least at this specific location. Evelyn felt something settle in her chest, Not satisfaction at being proven right, but the heavy certainty that came with discovering a problem that couldn't be ignored. How much longer until you reach bedrock? Another 10 to 15 feet. Maybe an hour of drilling. I'll wait. Richard ran a hand through his graying hair, his professional facade showing cracks. Miss Ross, even if this location shows higher saturation, it doesn't necessarily invalidate our overall approach. We may need to adjust the foundation design in this specific area, add additional drainage, but let's see what the full data shows before we decide what it means. He nodded curtly and returned to supervising the drill operation, his shoulders carrying tension that hadn't been there 3 hours earlier. Caleb moved to stand beside Evelyn, his voice low enough that the engineers couldn't hear. You okay? I don't know yet. Ask me after we see what's at 60 feet. For what it's worth, I didn't want to be right about this. I know, that's probably why I trusted you. They waited as the drill continued its descent, each new sample adding data points to a picture that was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. The moisture content remained elevated. The clay composition showed more variation than the grid samples had suggested. And at 58 feet, Sarah made a sound that drew everyone's immediate attention. We've hit water! Richard was at her side instantly. That's not possible. The water table readings showed… I know what they showed, but this core sample is saturated. We're pulling up mud, not soil. He examined the sample himself, his expression shifting from skepticism to dawning concern. Get me the grid sample data for the nearest boring locations. I need to see the exact coordinates and depths. Sarah pulled up the information on her tablet, and they studied it in tense silence. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice carefully controlled. Our nearest sample points were here and here. He indicated positions on the site map. Both showed water table depth of 7 to 9 feet. This location is directly between them. So we have a localized depression in the bedrock, Sarah said, a channel or basin that our grid spacing missed. Which means the bedrock isn't as uniform as our models assumed. And if there's one channel, there could be others. Richard looked at Evelyn, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw genuine uncertainty in his expression. We need to halt drilling and reassess. If the bedrock topology is more variable than our initial survey indicated, we need comprehensive mapping before we can design appropriate foundations. How comprehensive? We'd need to increase our boring density significantly, maybe triple or quadruple the number of test locations to ensure we're not missing other variations. How long would that take? Weeks, possibly months depending on what we find. And the cost? Significant. Plus, we'd need to re-engineer the foundation system based on the new data, which means new permits, new approvals, new timelines. Evelyn pulled out her phone and called Marcus. He answered before the first ring finished. Tell me you have good news. We found elevated water saturation and a bedrock channel that our initial survey missed. Richard recommends halting the project for comprehensive subsurface mapping. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that she checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Marcus? I'm here. I'm just trying to process how a single additional soil boring completely invalidated months of professional engineering analysis. It didn't invalidate the analysis. It revealed that the analysis was based on incomplete data. Jesus Christ, Evelyn, do you understand what you're telling me? We're 3 weeks from groundbreaking. We have financing commitments, contractor schedules, city approvals that expire if we don't move forward on timeline. You're proposing we throw all of that away because of one wet hole in the ground. I'm proposing we don't build luxury residential towers on foundations that might not be stable. Might not be, based on one data point that could be an anomaly. Or could be indicative of conditions across the entire site that we didn't properly assess. She heard him breathing hard, the sound of someone trying to maintain control. Put Richard on the phone. She handed her phone to the engineer, who took it with obvious reluctance. Marcus, this is Richard Torres. She couldn't hear Marcus's side of the conversation, but she could read Richard's responses in his increasingly defensive posture. Yes, I understand the timeline implications. No, I can't guarantee this is an isolated variation without additional testing. That's not how engineering works, Marcus. I can't just decide something is acceptable because it's convenient. Yes, I'm aware of what we're paying for professional judgment, but professional judgment requires adequate data. I won't stake my license on assumptions that could be wrong. He handed the phone back to Evelyn. He wants to talk to you. Marcus's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. I'm coming to the site. Don't make any final decisions until I get there. 20 minutes. The line went dead. Evelyn looked at Richard. He's on his way. I gathered. Look, Ms. Ross, I need to be clear about something. If we proceed with construction based on our current data, knowing what we've found here, and there are foundation failures, my firm's liability is significantly increased. I can't ethically recommend moving forward without additional investigation. I understand. Do you? Because Marcus seems to think this is a negotiable risk. It's not. This is a fundamental question about subsurface conditions that directly affect structural safety. Caleb had been quietly observing, but now he spoke. Mr. Torres, in your professional opinion, if you built according to the original plan and this bedrock channel extends across a significant portion of the foundation zone, what would happen? Richard considered the question seriously. Best case, you'd see differential settling, some parts of the building sinking more than others. That would cause structural stress, cracking, possibly damage to interior finishes and mechanical systems. Worst case, if the variation is severe enough and the saturated soil can't provide adequate lateral support, you could see foundation failure severe enough to compromise structural integrity. How long would that take to manifest? Could be years. Could be months. Depends on dozens of variables. Rainfall patterns, how quickly the drainage system addresses water accumulation, how the building load distributes across the variable bedrock. Engineering isn't fortune-telling. I can tell you what's possible, what's probable, but I can't predict specific outcomes with certainty. But you can say whether the risk is acceptable. Not alone. That's a decision that involves engineers, owners, financiers, insurance companies, and ultimately the people who live and work in these buildings. My job is to provide accurate information about conditions and risks. Other people decide what to do with that information. Evelyn watched the sun sink lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if she'd had any capacity to appreciate them. Instead, she felt the weight of the decision pressing down, the awareness that every choice from this point forward carried consequences that extended far beyond her own professional survival. Marcus's car pulled up in a spray of gravel, his German sedan looking aggressively out of place among the work trucks and equipment. He emerged already talking, his phone pressed to his ear, gesturing sharply as he finished a conversation with someone who was clearly getting bad news. He ended the call and strode toward them with the focused intensity of someone who'd decided confrontation was the only viable path forward. Show me what you found. Sarah brought up the soil data on her tablet, displaying the comparison between the grid samples and the new boring results. Marcus studied it with the careful attention of someone looking for flaws in an argument he'd already decided to reject. So we have elevated moisture in one location. That doesn't prove it's widespread. It proves our initial survey missed significant variation, Richard said, which means our foundation design might be based on incorrect assumptions about subsurface uniformity. Might be, could be. All speculation based on limited data. That's why I'm recommending additional testing, to replace speculation with certainty. Marcus turned to Evelyn. Do you know what additional testing means? We lose our financing. The construction window closes. By the time we complete new surveys and redesign and get new approvals, we're looking at 18 months minimum, and that's assuming the additional data doesn't reveal problems that make the project economically unviable. And if we build on bad foundations, what does that cost? We don't know the foundations are bad. We know one test location showed unexpected results. That's not the same thing. Caleb cleared his throat quietly. Mr. Hale, can I ask you something? Marcus's attention snapped to him with visible irritation. What? Have you ever seen a building fail? Actually watched one come down or collapse or have to be condemned because the foundations couldn't hold? No. Because we hire professionals who know how to prevent that from happening. I have. 3 times in 20 years, and every single time the people who built it were confident they'd done everything right. They had engineers and permits and approvals, they had analysis that showed acceptable risk, and they had financial pressure to move forward despite concerns that seemed minor at the time. Are you seriously comparing this project to building failures? I'm saying the pattern looks familiar, the confidence looks familiar, and the reasons for dismissing warning signs look very, very familiar. Marcus's face flushed. You're a mechanic. With all due respect, you don't have the expertise to assess complex engineering decisions. You're right, I don't. But I have the expertise to recognize when people are letting money override judgment. And right now, that's what I'm seeing. The words landed like a physical blow. Marcus took a step forward, and Evelyn moved between them instinctively. That's enough. Both of you. She looked at Marcus. He's not wrong about the pattern. Every engineering failure I've ever read about involved smart people making reasonable-sounding arguments for why concerns could be safely dismissed. The difference between success and catastrophe wasn't intelligence or expertise. It was whether people were willing to stop and verify when something didn't look right. So you're taking his side, a stranger you met a week ago over a partner you've worked with for 5 years. I'm not taking sides. I'm taking the position that we need complete information before we make irreversible decisions. The decision to delay is just as irreversible as the decision to proceed. Once we lose this financing, once we miss this window, the project is dead. You're choosing to kill it based on incomplete data that might show nothing significant. I'm choosing to verify before we commit millions of dollars and hundreds of people's safety to assumptions that might be wrong. Marcus stared at her, and she watched the calculation happening behind his eyes, the assessment of whether he could override her, whether he could proceed without her consent, whether their partnership could survive this fundamental disagreement. If you stop this project, he said finally, his voice low and hard, you're ending more than the development. You understand that, right? We can't come back from this kind of delay. The company won't survive it. Everything we've built together will be gone. And if we proceed and the buildings fail, everything we've built will be worse than gone. It'll be a cautionary tale about greed and negligence. You don't know that will happen, and you don't know it won't. The silence that followed felt absolute despite the ambient noise of equipment and distant traffic. Sarah and the other engineers had retreated to give them space, their body language making clear they wanted no part of this confrontation. Richard spoke quietly but firmly. For the record, I'm submitting a formal recommendation to halt construction pending additional subsurface investigation. That recommendation will be part of the project record. If you choose to proceed against that recommendation, that's your decision, but it will be documented that you did so against engineering advice. Marcus turned to him. Are you seriously threatening to document this? I'm following professional ethics requirements. If there are safety concerns and I don't document them, I'm liable, personally and professionally. There are no safety concerns. There are questions that don't have answers yet. That's different. Not in engineering, it's not. Questions without answers are exactly what safety concerns look like before they become disasters. Marcus looked around at the assembled group. Richard and his team, standing firm on their professional obligations, Caleb watching with quiet certainty, and Evelyn meeting his gaze without backing down. He was outnumbered, and he knew it. Fine, he said, the word clipped and bitter. Halt the project. Do your additional testing. Take your time making absolutely certain that every possible theoretical risk has been addressed. And when the financing falls through and the permits expire, and we have to explain to our investors why we destroyed a viable project over a wet hole in the ground, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly whose decision this was. He walked back to his car without waiting for a response, the door slamming with enough force to echo across the construction site. Evelyn watched him drive away, taillights disappearing into the gathering dusk, and felt the weight of what she'd just done settle fully onto her shoulders. She'd halted a major development project, potentially destroyed her company, definitely ended her partnership with Marcus in any meaningful sense, and she'd done it based largely on the observations of a mechanic she'd known for a week and a single soil boring that might prove to be an anomaly. Richard approached carefully. Ms. Ross, I know that was difficult. For what it's worth, I think you made the right call. Do you? Or are you just covering your professional liability? He considered the question seriously. Both can be true. I'm protecting my license and my firm's reputation, but I'm also genuinely concerned about what we found today. The bedrock variation is significant. The moisture levels are concerning, and the fact that our grid sampling missed it suggests our understanding of subsurface conditions is incomplete. Building on incomplete understanding is how disasters happen, or how opportunities die because we're too cautious to take calculated risks. Maybe, But I've been doing this for 23 years and I've learned that the cost of overcaution is usually financial. The cost of undercaution can be measured in lives. I know which risk I'd rather take. He and his team began packing up their equipment, the boring rig's engine shutting down and leaving a sudden quiet that felt heavy with implications. Caleb walked over, his expression thoughtful. You okay? I just potentially destroyed my career based significantly on your opinion. So, no, not particularly okay. For what it's worth, I think Richard is right. What they found today is concerning enough to justify additional investigation. Concerning enough or definitively dangerous? Because there's a difference, and I'm not sure which side of that line we're actually on. Neither am I, but isn't that exactly why you need to find out? She laughed, a sound without much humor. You're annoyingly logical for someone who keeps upending my life. I'm not trying to upend anything. I'm just pointing out what I see. I know, that's what makes it annoying. They stood in the fading light, watching Richard's team finish their work. The site that had been full of activity and purpose a few hours ago now felt abandoned, a place where ambitious plans had collided with inconvenient reality and come away damaged. Evelyn's phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. I hope you're prepared for the consequences of this decision, because they're going to be significant. She didn't reply. There was nothing to say that would change the trajectory they were on. The partnership was over. The company was probably over. The only question now was whether her decision would be vindicated by data or condemned by hindsight. I should go, Caleb said. Need to pick up Emma from art class. You want to get dinner or something? You look like you could use some company. I appreciate the offer, but I think I need to be alone with the magnitude of what I just did. Fair enough. But if you change your mind, my phone's on. He walked to his truck and she watched him go. This man who'd somehow become the catalyst for the most significant professional decision of her career. A decision that felt simultaneously necessary and potentially catastrophic. Her phone rang. Not Marcus this time, but Jennifer, her assistant. Miss Ross, I just got a call from Brad Hutchinson at First National. He's asking about rumors that the Riverside project is being halted. He sounded concerned about the financing commitments. Who told him we're halting? I don't know. But word is apparently spreading. I've got 3 other messages from stakeholders asking for clarification. Evelyn closed her eyes. Of course, word was spreading. Marcus was probably making calls right now, controlling the narrative, framing the delay as her unreasonable caution overriding sound engineering judgment. Tell anyone who asks that we're conducting additional subsurface investigation to ensure foundation integrity. Don't characterize it as a halt. Call it a prudent verification process. Should I schedule stakeholder meetings? Not yet. Let me talk to the engineering team about timeline for the additional boring tests. Once I know what we're looking at, I can have informed conversations about schedule impacts. Okay, Ms. Ross, are we going to be okay? It was a simple question that deserved an honest answer. I don't know, Jennifer, but we're going to make the best decisions we can with the information we have, and we're going to be able to look ourselves in the mirror afterward. That's all I can promise. She ended the call and walked to her car, the construction site empty now except for the equipment that would return tomorrow to continue excavating truth from ground that had already proven more complex than anyone expected. The drive home took her through downtown, past buildings that stood because someone had made good decisions about foundations and load-bearing walls and structural integrity. Past buildings that worked because the ground beneath them held, because the engineering assumptions proved correct, because the calculated risks turned out to be acceptable. Most of the time, the buildings stood, but not always. And the ones that didn't became lessons studied in engineering schools. Warnings about what happened when confidence exceeded caution, when financial pressure overrode professional judgment, when people who should have stopped and verified decided instead to hope and proceed. She didn't want Riverside to become one of those lessons, even if preventing it cost her everything else. Her apartment was dark and quiet when she arrived, the silence emphasizing how alone she was with the decision she'd made. She poured a glass of wine she didn't really want and stood at her window looking out at the city lights, all those buildings full of people who trusted that the ground beneath them would hold. Her phone buzzed again. This time, a text from Caleb. Emma says the terrarium presentation went really well. Teacher gave her an A. She wanted me to tell you that proper foundation matters for ecosystems too. I think she's been eavesdropping on my phone calls. Despite everything, Evelyn smiled. She texted back, "Tell her congratulations, and tell her she's absolutely right about foundations." His response came quickly. She says that's why we check the soil before we plant anything important. Kids are smarter than we give them credit for. Apparently so are mechanics. Sometimes we just pay attention to things other people are too busy to notice. Evelyn set down her phone and returned to the window, watching the city lights and thinking about attention and expertise and the difference between knowing everything and noticing what matters. Somewhere out there, Marcus was probably making calls, building his case, preparing to argue that she'd destroyed a viable project over theoretical concerns. Somewhere else, Richard was documenting his recommendations, protecting his professional liability while also genuinely trying to prevent disaster. And in a small house with a 9-year-old who understood that foundations mattered, Caleb Moore was probably helping with homework and making dinner and living a life that had nothing to do with real estate development except for the quiet certainty that buildings should be built to last. Tomorrow, the additional boring tests would begin. Data would accumulate. The picture of what lay beneath the Riverside site would become clearer, and with it, the answer to whether she'd made the right call or destroyed her career over concerns that proved unfounded. But tonight, all she had was the decision itself and the knowledge that she'd made it for the right reasons, even if the outcome remained uncertain. She finished her wine and went to bed, sleeping poorly but without regret, which felt like the only victory available in a day that had offered very few. The next morning arrived with gray skies and steady rain, the kind of sustained precipitation that turned the city's drainage systems into rushing channels and reminded everyone that water always found its way to the lowest point, regardless of human engineering intended to redirect it. Evelyn arrived at the office to find Jennifer already at her desk, looking stressed. "You have 17 messages from stakeholders. Marcus called twice, and Richard Torres wants to discuss the expanded boring schedule. Let's start with Richard. Put him through." The engineer's voice was steady but serious when the call connected. "Ms. Ross, I've worked up a preliminary plan for the additional subsurface investigation. Given what we found yesterday, I'm recommending a minimum of 36 additional boring locations distributed across the site. That will give us much better resolution on bedrock topology and water table variations." "How long will that take?" "If we can get equipment and crews scheduled quickly, maybe 3 weeks for the field work. Then another 2 weeks for analysis and revised foundation design. Call it 5 to 6 weeks total before we could restart construction with confidence." "And the cost?" "Ballpark, $250,000 for the additional investigation, plus another $100,000 for redesign work. That's assuming we don't find anything that requires more extensive changes. And if we do find something, then costs go up proportionally. But Ms. Ross, I need to be clear. This investigation is necessary regardless of cost. We can't proceed with the current design without understanding subsurface conditions much better than we do now." "I understand. Move forward with the plan. Send me the detailed proposal and timeline, and I'll handle the stakeholder communications." She ended the call and looked at Jennifer. "I need you to schedule a conference call with all major stakeholders for this afternoon, 2 o'clock, and prepare a presentation summarizing the engineering findings and the investigation plan." "What about Marcus? He's called 3 times." "Put him through now." Jennifer transferred the call. Marcus didn't bother with pleasantries. "I've been talking to our investors. They're not happy." "I imagine not. Neither am I." "This delay is going to cost us the financing, Evelyn. First National is already making noises about pulling out. The construction contractors are talking about liquidated damages for schedule disruption. We're looking at millions in losses even if the additional testing comes back clean. And if it doesn't come back clean? If we proceed and the buildings fail?" "You keep saying that like it's inevitable. It's not. It's one possible outcome among many, and probably not even the most likely one." Richard disagrees. He thinks the subsurface variation is significant enough to require investigation. Richard is covering his ass. That's what engineers do when there's any uncertainty. They recommend more studies, more testing, more time. It's professionally safe for him. It's financially catastrophic for us. "So what would you have me do? Override the engineering recommendation and build anyway?" I'd have you recognize that engineering is about acceptable risk, not absolute certainty. And right now, you're demanding a level of certainty that's impossible and unnecessary. Devil Evelyn felt her temper rising. What I'm demanding is that we don't build residential towers on ground we don't fully understand. That's not unreasonable. That's responsible. It's paranoid, and it's going to destroy everything we've worked for. Then we'll rebuild with clearer conscience than we'd have if we proceeded and people got hurt. People aren't going to get hurt. Jesus, Evelyn, you're acting like we're building death traps. We're following professional engineering guidance from licensed experts. That's what responsible development looks like. Following guidance based on incomplete data isn't responsible. It's hopeful. Marcus was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, become colder and more calculated. I'm calling an emergency board meeting for Friday. I'm going to ask the board to overrule your decision and proceed with the original timeline. You can't do that. We're equal partners. We're equal partners in a company that has a board of directors who ultimately control major decisions. And I'm going to make the case that your excessive caution is threatening the company's viability. And I'll make the case that your excessive confidence is threatening people's safety. Good. Let's let the board decide who they trust more. He hung up. Evelyn sat in the sudden silence, processing what had just happened. Marcus was going to force a showdown, making it a formal question of whose judgment the board trusted. And given that most board members had financial stakes in the project proceeding on schedule, she wasn't confident about which way they'd vote. Her phone buzzed. A text from Caleb. Saw the rain. Hope the construction site drainage is holding up. Let me know if you need anything. She smiled despite the situation. He was checking on her, but framing it as concern about site conditions, giving her an out to respond professionally rather than personally if she preferred. She texted back, Site is holding. My career is less certain. Marcus is forcing a board vote on whether to proceed. His response? When? Friday. Need someone in your corner? She hesitated, considering what it would mean to bring Caleb into a formal board meeting, what it would signal about her judgment and her partnerships and her willingness to rely on unconventional sources. Then she thought about how everyone else in that room would have financial incentives to proceed, professional relationships with Marcus, and minimal first-hand knowledge of what the boring tests had actually revealed. She texted back, Yes. Can you clear Friday afternoon? I'll be there. The days between Monday's discovery and Friday's board meeting passed with the strange compression of time that came from too many urgent tasks and too little sleep. Evelyn spent Tuesday and Wednesday in back-to-back calls with stakeholders, explaining the engineering concerns in language that balanced technical accuracy with accessibility, trying to convey why caution mattered without sounding like she was manufacturing crisis from normal construction challenges. Some stakeholders understood. The representative from the insurance company actually thanked her for the diligence, noting that foundation issues were among the costliest claims they handled. Others were less sympathetic. The lead investor from First National made it clear that financing was contingent on the original timeline, and delays, however well-intentioned, put the entire capital structure at risk. Richard's team worked around the clock conducting the additional boring tests, their equipment running in shifts to maximize progress despite the rain that continued throughout the week. By Thursday evening, they had completed 28 of the planned 36 locations, and the emerging picture was both validating and troubling. The bedrock wasn't uniform. Not even close. What the initial grid sampling had characterized as minor variation turned out to be significant topology, channels and depressions that created zones where the bedrock sat as much as 15 feet lower than surrounding areas. Those depressions had filled with saturated clay and silt over decades, creating pockets of unstable soil that would compress unpredictably under building load. The original foundation design, with its evenly distributed pilings, all assumed to reach bedrock at similar depths, would have placed some supports on solid rock and others on saturated soil. The differential support would have created exactly the kind of uneven settling Caleb had warned about, stressing the structure in ways it wasn't designed to handle. Richard's preliminary analysis suggested the foundation would need to be completely redesigned. Deeper pilings in the depression zones, additional lateral support, more robust drainage, and possibly a modified building layout that distributed load more carefully across the variable subsurface conditions. The redesign was possible, but it would add significant cost and at least 3 months to the schedule. Marcus received the same report Evelyn did, and his response came via a terse email that copied the entire board. This is exactly the kind of scope creep that kills projects. We hire engineers to solve problems, not create them. Original design was approved by qualified professionals and city authorities. Recommend we proceed as planned and address any settling issues through standard warranty and maintenance protocols. Evelyn read the email 3 times, each reading increasing her sense of disbelief. He was seriously suggesting they build knowing the foundations would settle unevenly, planning to address issues after people were already living in potentially unstable buildings. She replied to the full board distribution. Engineering analysis shows significant subsurface variation that invalidates original design assumptions. Proceeding without redesign creates unacceptable structural risk. Recommend we delay construction, implement revised foundation design, and adjust timeline accordingly. The battle lines were drawn. Thursday night, Evelyn met Caleb at Danny's bar, the place where this entire situation had started just 2 weeks earlier, though it felt like months. He was in his usual spot, wearing a dark blue flannel she hadn't seen before, but which had the same worn comfort as all his others. He'd clearly come straight from the shop, his hands showing the faint staining that came from a day working with engines. She slid onto the stool beside him without preamble. "Tell me I'm not crazy." "You're not crazy, cautious, thorough, and probably about to make some powerful people very angry, but not crazy. Marcus thinks I'm manufacturing crisis. The investors think I'm sabotaging the project, and tomorrow I have to convince a board of directors that I'm doing the responsible thing instead of destroying the company." Danny appeared with a beer for Caleb and raised an eyebrow at Evelyn. She nodded, and he poured her the same IPA she'd ordered on her first visit. "What does Richard say?" Caleb asked. "That the subsurface variation is significant and the original design is inadequate. He's putting it in writing, staking his professional license on the recommendation to redesign." "So you have expert support?" "I have one engineer's opinion against Marcus's confidence and a board's financial interest. I'm not sure that's enough." Caleb took a drink, considering. "What do you need from me tomorrow?" "Honestly, I don't know. Marcus is going to argue that we're overreacting to normal construction challenges, that every building faces subsurface variation and modern engineering knows how to handle it. He's going to make it sound like the responsible position is to trust the experts we hired and move forward. And you want me to explain why that's wrong? I want you to tell the truth about what you've seen, about building failures and the patterns that precede them, about the difference between engineering for ideal conditions and accounting for reality. I'm not an engineer, Evelyn. The board knows that. Marcus will use it to dismiss anything I say. But you're not invested in the outcome financially. You don't have a stake in the project proceeding. That gives you credibility the rest of us don't have." He smiled slightly. "Or it makes me the guy who doesn't understand how business works, making problems where none exist." "Do you think that's what you're doing?" "No. I think I'm pointing out that the ground under this project isn't what people assumed it was. What they do with that information is up to them. And if they ignore it, then eventually the ground will make the point for me. Might take years, might take months, but unstable foundations don't stay hidden forever." They drank in companionable silence for a while, the ambient noise of the bar providing a buffer against the weight of the coming confrontation. Evelyn found herself grateful for Caleb's presence, his complete lack of performance, his absence of agenda, the way he approached serious problems with calm attention rather than dramatic urgency. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "Why are you doing this? You could have walked away after that first night, could have mentioned your concerns and let me handle it. Why keep getting involved when it's clearly going to be complicated and probably unpleasant?" Caleb set down his glass, his expression thoughtful. "You remember I mentioned my wife died when Emma was 3? I do. The accident happened because someone made a decision that prioritized convenience over safety. The driver who hit her was working for a delivery company that pressured drivers to meet impossible schedules. He'd been on the road for 14 hours, was exhausted, but knew if he called in he'd lose the route and probably his job. So he kept driving, ran a red light, killed my wife and put 2 other people in the hospital." Evelyn felt her chest tighten. "I'm so sorry." The company settled out of court, paid a lot of money, admitted no wrongdoing, changed nothing about their scheduling practices. And I realized that's how it works most of the time. People make decisions that create risk, and when something bad happens, they pay money and move on, unless someone interrupts that pattern before the bad thing happens. So this is about Emma. This is about every Emma. Every kid who's going to grow up in buildings that we're constructing right now. I can't fix what happened to my wife, but I can maybe prevent some other kid from losing a parent because someone decided that meeting a timeline mattered more than building something safe. He said it without drama or self-righteousness, just plain truth delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone he used for everything else. But Evelyn heard the weight underneath, the lived experience of loss that had taught him the real cost of prioritizing convenience over caution. Does Emma know why you're involved in this? I told her I'm helping make sure some buildings get built correctly. She asked if that meant checking the foundations like we talked about. I said yes. She said that seemed like the right thing to do. He smiled. Then she asked if I was going to get paid for it. When I said no, she suggested I should reconsider my business model. Evelyn laughed despite herself. Smart kid. Too smart sometimes. Makes it hard to hide things from her. Do you want to hide things from her? Sometimes. She's 9. She shouldn't have to think about building failures and structural risk, and whether her dad is making enemies of powerful people by pointing out problems they don't want to see. But she does think about those things. Yeah, kids pay attention to more than we give them credit for. They hear the stress in your voice even when you're trying to hide it. They notice when you're worried even if you don't say why. He finished his beer. But they also notice when you do the right thing even though it's hard, and I figure that's worth modeling even if it complicates her life a little. Evelyn thought about her own childhood. Growing up in a household where business always came first and doing the right thing was less important than doing the profitable thing. She'd learned early that success meant making strategic decisions, building useful relationships, and not letting moral qualms interfere with practical opportunities. It had served her well professionally. It had also led her to this moment, sitting in a bar with a mechanic, preparing to potentially destroy her career because she'd finally encountered a line she couldn't cross. Thank you, she said quietly, for being willing to show up tomorrow, for caring about this when you didn't have to, for being honest when it would have been easier to stay quiet. You're welcome. But Evelyn, you need to know something. I can tell the truth about what I've seen and what concerns me, but I can't make the board believe it matters. That's up to you. I know. And if they vote to proceed anyway, if they decide the financial risk of delay outweighs the structural risk of building on bad foundations, I want you to know that you still did the right thing. You asked the questions, demanded verification, pushed for truth even when it was inconvenient. That matters regardless of outcome. Does it? If the buildings get built wrong and people get hurt, does it matter that I tried to stop it? Yes, because the alternative is not trying. Is going along with bad decisions because fighting them is too hard or too costly. And if everyone does that, if everyone decides that speaking up isn't worth the personal cost, then nothing ever changes. He stood, pulling cash from his wallet for his tab. I should head out. Emma has a soccer game early tomorrow morning, and I promised I'd help her practice corner kicks tonight. Good luck with that. Thanks. And Evelyn? Get some sleep tonight. Tomorrow's going to be difficult, and you need to be sharp. I'll try. He left, and she sat alone at the bar, watching the door close behind him and thinking about patterns and choices and the distance between doing what was easy and doing what was right. Friday morning arrived with clear skies, as if the weather was deliberately setting a stage for confrontation. Evelyn, dressed carefully in a charcoal suit that projected authority without aggression, paired with a silk blouse in deep blue that suggested confidence. She spent extra time on her appearance, aware that how she looked would affect how seriously people took her arguments. The board meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the main conference room. By noon, Evelyn had reviewed Richard's complete engineering analysis 3 times, memorizing key data points and making sure she could explain complex technical concepts in accessible language. She'd prepared a presentation that laid out the subsurface findings, the risks of proceeding with the original design, and the timeline and cost implications of proper redesign. Jennifer brought her lunch that she didn't eat, coffee that she drank too quickly, and nervous updates about who was arriving early and what conversations were happening in the hallways. Marcus is here, Jennifer reported at 1:30. He's in his office with Bill Henderson and Patricia Chen. They've been in there for an hour. Bill and Patricia were two of the board members most likely to side with Marcus. Bill because he had significant personal investment in the project. Patricia because she generally deferred to whoever spoke with the most confidence. Marcus meeting with them privately wasn't surprising, but it confirmed he was building his coalition before the formal meeting even started. At 1:45, Caleb arrived. He'd cleaned up, wearing dark jeans without stains and a button-down shirt in charcoal gray that actually fit properly. He'd shaved and his hair was neatly combed. He looked professional without looking like he was trying to be someone he wasn't. "You clean up well," Evelyn said. "Emma helped me pick the shirt. She said I needed to look like someone people would listen to, not someone they'd dismiss." He smiled slightly. Then she gave me a 20-minute lecture on the importance of first impressions and body language. I'm not sure where she learned half of it. YouTube, probably. Probably. She also told me to speak clearly, make eye contact, and not use any curse words even if people are being stupid. That's good advice. She's full of good advice. Execution is my problem. Richard arrived at a 1:55, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the expression of someone preparing for professional combat. He nodded to Evelyn and Caleb, then took a position near the presentation screen, setting up his laptop and materials with methodical precision. The board members began filing in, 7 people total, who would ultimately decide the project's fate. Marcus entered last, his timing calculated to suggest he was busy with important matters rather than nervous about the outcome. He saw Caleb and his stride faltered almost imperceptibly before he recovered and took his seat at the head of the table. "Before we begin," Marcus said, his tone carrying the particular authority of someone who'd already decided how the meeting should go, "I want to acknowledge that we're here to discuss serious concerns raised by my partner about the Riverside project. I take those concerns seriously. We all do. But I also want to make sure we're balancing appropriate caution with business reality. Evelyn, the floor is yours." It was a gracious opening that subtly framed her position as possibly excessive while positioning him as the reasonable voice of balance. She'd expected nothing less. Evelyn stood, moving to the presentation screen. "Thank you all for making time for this meeting. I'm going to walk you through recent engineering findings that have significant implications for the Riverside project timeline and approach." She advanced to the first slide, showing the site map with the original boring locations marked. "Our initial subsurface investigation used industry-standard grid sampling to assess bedrock depth and soil composition. Based on those samples, we designed foundations using deep pilings that would reach bedrock at approximately 60 feet. Next slide, showing the new boring locations and what they'd revealed. Additional investigation conducted this week found significant bedrock variation that our grid sampling missed. Instead of uniform bedrock depth, we're seeing channels and depressions that create zones where bedrock sits up to 15 feet lower than surrounding areas. Those depressions are filled with saturated clay that will compress under building load." She let that information settle, watching board members lean forward to study the data. "Richard Torres, our structural engineer, is here to explain the implications." "Richard?" He stood, his professional demeanor firmly in place. "Thank you, Ms. Ross. The subsurface variation we've discovered creates a situation where our original foundation design would place some pilings on solid bedrock and others on compressible soil. This differential support would cause uneven settling, some parts of the building sinking more than others. Over time, that would create structural stress severe enough to crack walls, damage mechanical systems, and potentially compromise structural integrity." Bill Henderson spoke up, his voice carrying skepticism. "Buildings settle. That's normal. Are you saying this settling would be outside normal parameters?" "Yes. Normal settling is measured in millimeters and occurs uniformly across the foundation. What we'd see here is differential settling potentially measured in inches, concentrated in specific zones. That's not normal. That's structural failure developing over time." Patricia Chen frowned at the data. "But the original design was approved by the city. They reviewed the engineering analysis and signed off. Are you saying their approval was inadequate?" "I'm saying the approval was based on incomplete data. The city reviews engineering submissions and verifies they meet code requirements. They don't conduct independent subsurface investigations. When we told them bedrock was at 60 feet based on our sampling, they had no reason to question it. Now we know that assumption was wrong in significant portions of the site. Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious and concerned in a way that felt calculated. Richard, I appreciate your thoroughness, but help me understand something. You designed the original foundation system. Your firm stamped the drawings. You told us the approach was sound. Now you're saying it's inadequate. What changed? The ground or your analysis? It was a good attack, questioning Richard's consistency rather than his findings. The engineer didn't flinch. What changed is the data. The original analysis was based on the information available at that time. The new boring tests revealed conditions that weren't apparent in our grid sampling. That's not a failure of analysis. That's the discovery of information that changes our understanding. Or it's second-guessing based on one anomalous test location. It's not one location. It's 28 additional boring tests showing consistent patterns of bedrock variation across the site. Tests that Evelyn insisted on based on concerns raised by someone with no engineering credentials. The statement hung in the air, and everyone's attention shifted to Caleb, who'd been sitting quietly near the back of the room. Evelyn spoke before Marcus could continue. Caleb Moore has direct experience with building failures in this specific area. His observations about subsurface conditions proved accurate when we tested them. That's not lack of credentials. That's empirical knowledge gained from years of working on structures in this district. He's a mechanic, Marcus said, not unkindly, but with the finality of someone dismissing irrelevant input. I'm sure he's very good at fixing cars. That doesn't qualify him to assess complex engineering decisions. Caleb stood, his movement unhurried. You're right. I'm not qualified to design foundations or calculate load-bearing requirements or engineer drainage systems. But I am qualified to recognize when ground isn't stable, when buildings are showing stress from settling, and when confident people are dismissing warning signs because they're inconvenient. And you've seen that here? I've seen it in 3 buildings in this area over the last 20 years. All 3 had foundation problems that started small and got worse. All 3 were built by developers who hired qualified engineers and got city approval. And all 3 eventually either needed expensive retrofitting or were condemned. I'm not saying I know better than Richard. I'm saying the ground doesn't care about anyone's credentials. It either holds or it doesn't. Bill Henderson looked annoyed. With respect, Mr. Moore, anecdotal observations about other buildings don't tell us anything definitive about this site. We've done extensive testing. We have professional engineering analysis. We have city approval. At some point, we have to trust expertise rather than speculation. The expertise is telling you there's a problem, Caleb replied evenly. Richard is recommending redesign. That's not speculation. That's professional judgment based on new data. Professional judgment that conveniently requires more time and more money and more delay. Marcus's tone sharpened. Let's be honest about what's happening here. This project is expensive and complex. It carries risk, like any major development. Some people are comfortable with that risk. Others want absolute certainty before proceeding. But absolute certainty doesn't exist in construction. At some point, you make informed decisions and move forward. Patricia spoke, her voice thoughtful. Marcus, are you suggesting we proceed with the original design despite Richard's concerns? I'm suggesting we trust the engineering firm we hired to design solutions, not create obstacles. If there are subsurface variations, they can be addressed through modified piling depths in specific locations. That's standard practice. We don't need to delay the entire project and redesign everything because some test locations showed different conditions. Richard's professional composure cracked slightly. That's not how structural engineering works. You can't just make ad hoc adjustments to foundation design and hope it works out. The entire system needs to be engineered as an integrated whole that accounts for the actual subsurface conditions. Then engineer it that way, but do it within the existing timeline and budget. That's not possible. Proper redesign takes time. Then do improper redesign quickly, because the cost of delay is going to bankrupt this company. The statement shifted the energy in the room, making explicit what everyone had been thinking. This wasn't just about engineering anymore, it was about survival. The company had leveraged heavily for this project. Delay meant lost financing, penalty payments, destroyed relationships with investors and contractors. It might literally end the company. Evelyn felt the weight of that reality pressing down, the awareness that she was potentially destroying everything she'd built over her insistence on doing things correctly rather than expeditiously. Bill Henderson cleared his throat. I think we need to be pragmatic here. Yes, there are engineering concerns, but there are also business realities. Evelyn, you've made your case for additional investigation and redesign. I respect that. But I need you to also acknowledge the costs of that approach. I do acknowledge them. They're significant. Potentially fatal to the company. Yes. And you still think delay is the right choice? She looked around the room at the faces of people who'd invested money and reputation in this project, who trusted her and Marcus to make it successful, who now faced the possibility of significant losses because she'd insisted on asking questions that led to inconvenient answers. I think building on unstable foundations is the wrong choice, she said carefully. The cost of delay is financial. The cost of proceeding with inadequate design is potentially measured in lives. I know which risk I'm willing to take. Marcus stood, his expression grave. This is exactly the kind of false choice that paralyzes decision-making. We're not choosing between safety and profit. We're choosing between reasonable caution and excessive delay. Richard, tell me honestly, in your professional opinion, if we modify the piling depths in the depression zones and add supplemental drainage, can we proceed safely? Richard looked trapped, caught between professional ethics and the pressure of the moment. With appropriate modifications, yes, but those modifications need to be properly engineered, not improvised. That requires time and money, I know, but how much time? Days? Weeks? Weeks, minimum. Possibly months, depending on, so not years. Not insurmountable. Just difficult and expensive. Marcus turned to the board. I propose we authorize Richard to develop a modified design that addresses the subsurface variations within a compressed timeline. Give him 3 weeks to produce a revised foundation plan that we can submit for new permits. That's a reasonable compromise between Evelyn's safety concerns and the business necessity of keeping this project viable. It was a masterful move, framing himself as the reasonable compromiser who took safety seriously while also respecting business reality. Several board members nodded, clearly finding the middle path appealing. Evelyn felt the vote slipping away. 3 weeks isn't enough time to properly engineer complex foundation modifications. Richard just said weeks, not months. 3 weeks is weeks. I said weeks minimum, plural, and I said possibly months. You can't compress structural engineering into arbitrary timelines just because they're financially convenient. I can't waste months on analysis paralysis while the company dies. Evelyn, I understand you're trying to be responsible, but responsibility includes keeping the company solvent. It includes protecting the jobs of everyone who works here. It includes honoring our commitments to investors and contractors and the city. You're so focused on theoretical structural risks that you're ignoring the very real risk of destroying everything we've built. What we've built doesn't matter if it's built on ground that won't hold. And it definitely won't exist if we can't pay for it. Marcus's control slipped, real frustration breaking through. Do you understand what you're doing? You're killing this project. You're killing this company. You're killing partnerships and relationships and opportunities that took years to build. And you're doing it because a mechanic told you he once saw a building with foundation problems. Caleb spoke quietly but clearly. I've seen 3 buildings with foundation problems. All in this area. All built by people who were confident they'd done everything right. And in every case, the problems started small and became catastrophic because no one wanted to acknowledge them until it was too late. That has nothing to do with our project. It has everything to do with your project. Because you're following the same pattern, dismissing concerns because they're inconvenient, pressuring experts to give you the answers you want instead of the truth you need, treating caution like paranoia and confidence like competence. You don't get to lecture me about competence. You're not even supposed to be here. I'm here because Evelyn asked me to be, because she wanted someone in the room who doesn't have money on the line and might actually tell the truth. The truth is that you're not qualified to have an opinion about this project. Then listen to Richard. He's qualified, and he's telling you the same thing I am. The ground under this project isn't what you assumed, and building on bad assumptions creates bad outcomes. Bill Henderson interrupted, clearly trying to restore order. Gentlemen, let's keep this professional. We're all on the same team here. Are we? Marcus looked directly at Evelyn. Because from where I'm sitting, my partner has sided with a stranger over her own company. She's chosen theoretical risks over business survival, and she's apparently willing to destroy everything we've built together rather than trust the experts we've hired to solve problems. Evelyn met his gaze steadily. I've chosen to prioritize structural safety over schedule convenience. If that destroys our partnership, then our partnership was built on ground as unstable as Riverside's foundation. The silence that followed felt absolute. She'd just acknowledged what everyone had been thinking. The partnership was over regardless of how the vote went. Either Marcus would get his way, and she'd resign rather than be complicit in what she considered reckless construction, or she'd get her way and he'd leave rather than accept what he considered excessive caution. Patricia Chen spoke carefully. I think we need to vote on a specific proposal. Marcus has suggested authorizing Richard to develop modified designs on an accelerated timeline. Evelyn is arguing that timeline is inadequate. Richard, give us your professional opinion. Can you produce a safe, responsible redesign in 3 weeks? Richard looked at Evelyn, then at Marcus, then at his own hands. I can produce something in 3 weeks. Whether it will be as thoroughly vetted as it should be is another question. Compressed timelines create pressure to make assumptions and accept uncertainties that proper analysis would resolve. So you're saying no. I'm saying 3 weeks forces compromises that I'm not comfortable making. What about 6 weeks? Bill asked. That's still half the time of your original estimate, but gives you more room to work. Richard considered. 6 weeks is more realistic. I could work with that if I bring in additional engineering resources. Marcus shook his head. 6 weeks might as well be 6 months. By the time we get new permits and restart construction, we've lost the financing window. First National has made that clear. Then we find different financing, Evelyn said. There is no different financing. We've spent 18 months putting this capital structure together. You can't just replace institutional investors on a whim. So we scale down the project, build fewer units, reduce the scope to something we can finance differently. That's not viable. The economics only work at the current scale. Anything smaller loses money. Patricia raised her hands for quiet. I think we need to call for a formal vote. The question is whether to authorize continuation of the Riverside project on the original timeline with modified foundation design to be completed in 3 weeks, or to delay the project for comprehensive redesign on a 6-week timeline. All in favor of 3-week modification? Marcus raised his hand immediately. Bill Henderson followed. After a moment's hesitation, Patricia raised hers as well. 3 votes for proceeding quickly. All in favor of 6-week redesign? Evelyn raised her hand. 2 other board members, a retired structural engineer named Thomas Wright and a real estate attorney named Lisa Mendez, raised theirs. 3 votes for delay. 1 board member remained, Jack Foster, a venture capitalist who'd been quiet throughout the entire meeting, watching the debate with the analytical attention of someone calculating risks and probabilities. Everyone looked at him. He leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. I've been listening to both sides, and I keep coming back to one question. Richard, in your professional opinion, what's the probability of structural failure if we proceed with the 3-week modification plan versus the 6-week comprehensive redesign? Richard hesitated. I can't give you precise probabilities. Too many variables. Give me your best estimate, as someone who's been doing this for 2 decades. 3-week plan carries maybe 20 to 30% risk of significant settling issues that require expensive remediation. 6-week plan reduces that to under 5%. And by significant settling issues, you mean? Cracked walls, damaged systems, possible structural stress that compromises building integrity over time. Over how much time? Could be years, could be months. Depends on rainfall, drainage performance, dozens of factors. Jack nodded slowly. So we're talking about the difference between a 1 in 4 chance of expensive problems versus a 1 in 20 chance. Roughly, yes. And the cost difference between the timelines, Marcus answered. 3 weeks keeps us in the financing window. 6 weeks kills it. That's the difference between a viable project and a dead one. Unless the buildings fail and we face lawsuits and reputation damage that destroy the company anyway. Jack looked at Evelyn. You really think this is worth killing the project over? I think it's worth building correctly even if it costs more and takes longer. And you, Marcus, really think it's worth the risk to proceed quickly? I think the risk of delay is more certain and more catastrophic than the risk of structural issues that might never materialize. Jack was quiet for a long moment, and Evelyn realized her entire career was balanced on whatever calculation this man was running in his head. He had the deciding vote. His decision would determine not just the Riverside project, but the future of the company, her partnership with Marcus, possibly her entire professional trajectory. I vote for a 6-week redesign, Jack said finally. The risk profile on the 3-week plan is too high. I'd rather lose financing and find alternative capital than build something that has a 1 in 4 chance of needing expensive remediation. That's not conservative, that's just math. Evelyn felt something release in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is a mistake. You're all making a decision based on fear rather than business judgment. And when this company fails because we couldn't move fast enough, I hope you remember this vote. He walked out without waiting for response, the door closing behind him with controlled force. The remaining board members sat in uncomfortable silence. Bill Henderson spoke first. Well, that was definitive. Evelyn, I assume you'll take point on finding alternative financing? I will. And on managing the timeline and stakeholder communications. Good. Because we've just made a very expensive bet that safety is worth more than speed. I hope we're right. So do I. The meeting broke up, board members filing out with the subdued energy of people who'd just made a decision they hoped they wouldn't regret. Richard approached Evelyn, his expression relieved but concerned. Thank you for backing the 6-week timeline. It's the right call. I hope so, because if we're wrong, we've destroyed the company for nothing. You're not wrong. The data is clear. The subsurface variation is real. Building on it without proper design is reckless. Tell that to Marcus. Marcus is angry because he's scared. He leveraged everything on this project working on his timeline. Now that timeline is gone and he's facing the possibility of losing everything. That's terrifying, even if it's necessary. Evelyn nodded, understanding but not particularly sympathetic. Marcus had put them in this position by pushing forward aggressively without adequate verification. The fact that caution now looked like obstruction was a problem of his own making. Caleb waited until the room was nearly empty before approaching. You okay? Define okay. Still employed, still standing, still on the right side of your own conscience. Then yes, barely. That's more than some people can say. They walked out together, emerging into the late afternoon sunlight that seemed too bright and cheerful for the weight of what had just transpired. Evelyn's phone was already buzzing with messages, some supportive, some angry, some asking what happened and what came next. She ignored them all. Can I buy you dinner? She asked Caleb. As a thank you for showing up and telling the truth even though it made you a target? You don't need to thank me, but I'll accept dinner anyway. Emma's at a sleepover tonight, so I've got time. They walked to a small Italian place 3 blocks from the office, a neighborhood restaurant where Evelyn had eaten dozens of lunches, but never taken time to really notice the warmth of the space or the care in the food. They ordered without looking at menus, pasta for her, chicken parmesan for him, and sat in comfortable quiet while the weight of the day settled. Do you think we made the right call? She asked finally. I think you made the only call you could make and still look yourself in the mirror. Whether it's right depends on what the redesign shows, and whether you can find new financing and about 100 other factors you can't control. That's not very comforting. Sorry, I'm not good at comfortable lies. I've noticed. They ate slowly, talking about small things, Emma's soccer team, Evelyn's attempts at running that never quite became a habit, the peculiar satisfaction of fixing something broken with your own hands. The conversation felt like a gift after hours of high-stakes conflict, a reminder that life continued in its small routines regardless of board votes and engineering crises. Over coffee, Caleb asked the question Evelyn had been avoiding thinking about. What happens with you and Marcus now? I honestly don't know. The partnership is over, that's clear. Whether he leaves or I leave, or we somehow find a way to dissolve the company without destroying each other, is still to be determined. He's angrier than I expected. He's scared. Everything he's built is at risk because I insisted on asking questions he didn't want answered. That's terrifying from his perspective. From your perspective, too. Yes, but I'd rather be terrified and right than confident and catastrophically wrong. That's a good principle to live by. She smiled. I'm starting to collect those. Turns out ethics in business is more complicated than I thought. Ethics anywhere is complicated. Business just makes the stakes more obvious. They finished their meal and stepped back out into the evening, the city settling into its nighttime rhythm of lights and movement. Evelyn felt exhausted but oddly at peace, aware that she'd made enemies and possibly destroyed her career, but had done so for reasons she could defend. Thank you again, she said as they reached the corner where their paths diverged. For everything. For noticing what others missed. For speaking up when staying quiet would have been easier. For being someone I could trust when I wasn't sure who to believe. You're welcome. But Evelyn, you need to give yourself credit too. I pointed out a problem. You're the one who had the courage to act on it, even when it cost you everything. Haven't lost everything yet. Still standing, remember? Still standing, he agreed. And that counts for more than most people realize. He walked toward his truck, and she watched him go. This unlikely ally who'd entered her life by chance and changed its trajectory completely. Then she turned and walked to her own car, pulling out her phone to begin the work of salvaging what could be salvaged from the wreckage of the Riverside project. The first call was to Richard, authorizing him to bring in additional engineering resources and begin the comprehensive redesign. The second was to the board, outlining a plan for stakeholder communications and alternative financing strategies. The third was to her lawyer, beginning the difficult conversation about how to unwind a partnership that had become untenable. By the time she got home, it was past midnight, and her apartment felt empty in a way it never had before. She poured wine she didn't drink and stood at her window looking at the city lights, all those buildings standing because someone had made good decisions about foundations and load-bearing walls and structural integrity. Tomorrow the real work would begin, finding financing, managing stakeholders, rebuilding what had been broken by necessary truth. But tonight, she let herself feel the cost of what she'd done and the value of having done it anyway. Her phone buzzed one last time, a text from Caleb. Emma wanted me to tell you that foundations matter and you did the right thing. Also, she says you should get a good night's sleep because tired people make bad decisions. She's very wise. Evelyn smiled and texted back. Tell Emma thank you and that she's absolutely right. About everything. Then she finally went to bed, sleeping better than she had in weeks despite knowing that everything was uncertain and nothing was guaranteed except that she'd chosen truth over convenience and could live with whatever came next. The 6 weeks that followed the board meeting unfolded with the relentless momentum of consequences that couldn't be avoided or delayed. Evelyn spent the first week in back-to-back meetings with stakeholders, delivering news that no one wanted to hear with a directness that left little room for negotiation. First National withdrew their financing commitment within 48 hours, exactly as Marcus had predicted. The construction contractors filed for delay penalties. 3 of the smaller investors threatened legal action for what they characterized as breach of good faith. Marcus stopped coming to the office entirely. His lawyer sent formal notice of intent to dissolve the partnership, citing irreconcilable differences in business philosophy and decision-making approach. The document was professionally worded, but carried the unmistakable weight of betrayal underneath the legal language. They'd built the company together over 5 years, navigated difficult projects and financial pressures, and the normal friction of partnership. All of it had apparently been contingent on never fundamentally disagreeing about something that mattered. Evelyn signed the dissolution papers without contest. Fighting would have been expensive and pointless, burning through resources the company couldn't afford to waste. Better to let him go cleanly and focus on salvaging what remained. Richard's engineering team worked with quiet intensity, conducting additional subsurface investigations that revealed the full scope of what the original survey had missed. The bedrock variations were even more significant than the initial boring tests had suggested, creating a complex topology that required completely rethinking how load would be distributed across the foundation. The revised design called for a hybrid system, deep pilings in the stable zones, reinforced mat foundations in the depression areas, and an integrated network of drainage and monitoring systems that could detect and address water accumulation before it became problematic. It was elegant engineering that solved real problems. It was also expensive, adding approximately $4 million to the foundation costs and extending the construction timeline by an additional 3 months beyond the 6-week redesign period. By the third week, Evelyn had met with 11 different financing groups, pitching a project that now carried the stigma of delay and the reality of increased costs. Most meetings ended with polite versions of no, appreciation for her diligence, respect for prioritizing safety, but ultimately unwillingness to invest in a development that had already proven more complicated than initially presented. The 12th meeting was with a family investment office run by a woman named Catherine Liu, who'd made her fortune in commercial real estate before shifting to more selective projects that aligned with her values rather than just her profit targets. She listened to Evelyn's presentation without interruption, studied Richard's engineering analysis with obvious comprehension, and asked questions that suggested genuine interest rather than polite deflection. "Why did your partner leave?" Catherine asked, her directness catching Evelyn off guard. "We had fundamental disagreement about whether to proceed on the original timeline or delay for comprehensive redesign. The board voted for delay. Marcus couldn't accept that decision. Because of the financial implications? Partly. Also because he felt I'd prioritized excessive caution over business judgment. And what do you think?" "I think I prioritize structural safety over schedule convenience. Whether that's excessive caution or appropriate diligence depends on your perspective." Catherine smiled slightly. "I'm asking for your perspective, not Marcus's." Evelyn met her gaze directly. "I think buildings full of people shouldn't be constructed on foundations we know are inadequate. I think the cost of delay, however significant, is acceptable compared to the cost of structural failure. And I think if doing the responsible thing destroys my company, then I'd rather have a destroyed company than a compromised conscience." "That's an expensive moral position." "I'm aware. Most developers wouldn't take it. They'd find ways to rationalize proceeding, to minimize the risks, to convince themselves that everything would probably work out fine. I know, I almost did that myself." "What stopped you?" Evelyn thought about Caleb sitting at Danny's bar, completely unbothered by mockery, offering truth without agenda. She thought about Richard's growing concern as the boring tests revealed conditions he hadn't anticipated. She thought about Emma's terrarium presentation and the simple wisdom that proper foundations mattered for anything you wanted to last. Someone I trust pointed out that the pattern looked familiar, that confident people dismissing warning signs is how disasters happen, and I realized I didn't want to be part of that pattern, regardless of cost. Catherine nodded slowly, making notes on her tablet. "I'm going to be direct with you, Ms. Ross. This project is troubled. You've had partnership dissolution, financing withdrawal, contractor disputes, and significant cost overruns before breaking ground. Most investors would walk away from that combination of red flags." "I understand, but I'm not most investors. I've been in this business for 30 years, and I've learned that the quality of people matters more than the cleanliness of deals. Good people can salvage troubled projects. Bad people destroy clean ones." She set down her tablet. "I'm interested in financing Riverside, but I have conditions." Evelyn felt hope spark for the first time in weeks. "I'm listening." "First, Richard Torres stays as the engineering lead throughout construction. No substitutions, no cost-cutting that compromises his design." "Agreed." "Second, I want monthly progress reviews with full transparency. No surprises, no glossing over problems, no optimistic projections that aren't grounded in reality." "Absolutely." "Third, I want the mechanic who identified the foundation issues brought in as a quality oversight consultant. Paid position, formal role, authority to raise concerns directly to me." Evelyn blinked. "You want Caleb Moore on the project team?" "I want someone involved who doesn't have financial incentive to overlook problems. Someone who's proven willing to speak up when things don't look right. From what you've told me, that's Mr. Moore. He runs an auto shop. He's not a construction professional." "Neither am I, originally. I started in commercial property management, learning buildings from the ground up by watching what failed and what lasted. Sometimes the best oversight comes from people who understand consequences rather than just calculations." Catherine's expression was firm. "That's my third condition, non-negotiable." "Then I accept all 3 conditions." "Good. I'll have my team draw up term sheets. Assuming the numbers work, we can close financing within 3 weeks and restart construction on the revised timeline. They shook hands, and Evelyn left the meeting feeling something she'd almost forgotten: possibility. The project wasn't dead. The company might survive, and she'd done it without compromising the principles that had nearly destroyed everything. She called Caleb from her car, not bothering with preamble when he answered. "How would you feel about becoming a paid quality oversight consultant for the Riverside project?" There was a pause. "I'd feel confused about what that means." "It means the new investor wants you formally involved to provide independent oversight, raise concerns, spot problems, be the voice that isn't afraid to point out when something doesn't look right." "Evelyn, I'm not qualified for that kind of role." "You're qualified to notice what others miss and speak up about it. Apparently that's exactly what Catherine Liu is looking for." "Catherine Liu? The Catherine Liu who built half the commercial district?" "The same. She's impressed by your willingness to identify problems that experts missed. Wants you on the team to make sure we don't miss anything else." Another pause. "What does Emma think about this?" The question surprised her. Why would Emma's opinion matter? "Because if I take this job, I'll be spending time away from the shop, going to construction sites, being involved in something that might get complicated. That affects her life. I don't make decisions like that without talking to her first." It was such a fundamentally different approach than Evelyn was used to, considering a 9-year-old's input on professional decisions, treating her perspective as genuinely important rather than just something to be managed. But it was also completely consistent with everything she'd learned about Caleb, this man who'd built his entire life around showing up for his daughter and teaching her that her voice mattered. "Talk to Emma," Evelyn said. "Let me know what you both decide." That evening, Caleb sat with his daughter at their kitchen table. The remains of dinner cleared away and homework spread between them. Emma was working on a math worksheet, her concentration absolute as she worked through fraction problems that would have frustrated most adults. "Em, I need to talk to you about something." She looked up, immediately attentive. "Did something happen with the building project?" "Sort of. They found a new investor who wants to move forward with the proper foundation design. But she has a condition. She wants me to be part of the project team to help make sure things are built correctly." Emma processed this with the seriousness she brought to everything. "Would you get paid?" "Yes." "How much?" "We haven't talked specific numbers yet, but it would be real money, not just volunteer time." "Would you have to close the shop?" "No. I'd keep the shop running but spend some time each week at the construction site. Might mean some longer days, some schedule adjustments." "Would it be dangerous?" "No more dangerous than working on cars. Construction sites have safety rules just like auto shops." Emma thought about this, her expression thoughtful. "Do you want to do it?" It was the question Caleb had been asking himself since Evelyn's call. Did he want to be formally involved in this project, taking on responsibility and visibility in a world where he'd always been more comfortable staying in the background? Did he want to commit time and energy to something that could still fail, despite everyone's best intentions? "I think I do," he said honestly, "because I think it matters, and because I think I can help make sure it's done right." "Then you should do it." She said it with the simple certainty of someone who'd learned to trust her father's judgment about what mattered. "Even if it means some changes to our routine, some evenings where I'm at meetings instead of home?" "Dad, I'm 9. Not 5. I can handle some schedule changes. And besides, you're always telling me that doing important things sometimes means adjusting our comfort. This seems important." Caleb smiled, wondering when exactly his daughter had become wiser than him. "When did you get so smart?" "I've always been smart. You're just now noticing because I'm using it to give you permission to do something you already want to do." Fair point. She returned to her fractions, the matter apparently settled in her mind. Caleb pulled out his phone and texted Evelyn. "Emma approves. Count me in." The response came quickly. "Tell Emma thank you for her wisdom, and welcome to the team." Richard's redesign was completed on schedule, a comprehensive foundation system that addressed every subsurface variation the expanded boring tests had revealed. The plans were thorough, conservative, and exactly what Evelyn had been hoping for when she'd insisted on proper investigation. The city's engineering review took 2 weeks but ultimately resulted in approved permits. the reviewers noting in their documentation that the revised design represented best practices for construction on variable subsurface conditions. Catherine Liu's financing closed 3 weeks after their initial meeting, providing capital sufficient to cover the increased foundation costs and the extended timeline. The terms were tougher than First National had offered: higher interest rates, more stringent milestone requirements, personal guarantees that made Evelyn's stomach clench when she signed them. But it was money that came without pressure to cut corners or compromise safety, which made it worth every difficult condition. Construction restarted on a clear morning in late autumn, the foundation excavation beginning with careful attention to the subsurface mapping that now guided every decision. Caleb showed up for the first day wearing a hard hat that Emma had decorated with stickers of tools and a handwritten label that said, "Quality Matters." The construction foreman, a gruff man named Tony Vasquez, who'd been in the business for 30 years, looked at the hat and then at Caleb with obvious skepticism. "You're the mechanic they brought in to watch us?" "I'm here to provide independent oversight. Make sure what gets built matches what was designed." "You know how to read structural drawings?" "I know how to ask questions when something doesn't look right." "That enough for you?" Tony studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's enough. Just stay out of the way of the equipment and don't tell my guys how to do their jobs unless you've got a good reason." "Fair deal." They shook hands, and Caleb spent that first day mostly watching and learning, asking Tony questions about process and sequence and how the foundation work would proceed. The foreman warmed to him gradually, appreciating that Caleb asked informed questions rather than making uninformed criticisms, that he understood the difference between how things looked on plans and how they worked in reality. By the end of the first week, Tony was actively seeking Caleb's input on decisions about piling placement in areas where the bedrock depth varied from the engineered specifications. They'd brought in surveying equipment to verify actual conditions before driving pilings, and twice they found variations significant enough to require consultation with Richard about modified placement. "This is why we do the verification," Richard said during one such consultation, standing in the excavation zone and comparing survey data to his design drawings. The subsurface investigation was comprehensive, but it's still based on discrete boring locations. Reality between those points can surprise you. "So we adjust," Caleb said. "Exactly. We designed with enough flexibility to handle reasonable variations. When we find conditions outside that range, we adapt the design rather than forcing the construction." It was a fundamentally different approach than the original project had embodied, building with attention to reality rather than confidence in assumptions, treating unexpected conditions as information rather than obstacles, designing systems robust enough to handle variation instead of requiring perfect uniformity. The foundation work progressed steadily through autumn and into early winter, the deep pilings reaching bedrock in the stable zones while the reinforced mat foundations were carefully constructed in the depression areas. The drainage system went in with particular attention to redundancy and monitoring capability, installing sensors that would provide real-time data about water accumulation and pump performance. Evelyn visited the site weekly, walking the excavation zones with Richard and Caleb, learning to read the ground in ways she'd never bothered with before. She began to understand what Caleb had seen that first night when he'd mentioned foundation problems, the subtle signs of instability, the way water pooled where it shouldn't, the difference between soil that would hold weight and soil that would compress under load. 3 months into construction, the foundation work was complete and the vertical structure began rising from the carefully engineered base. The buildings emerged floor by floor, their progress visible from downtown, a physical manifestation of decisions made and consequences accepted. Marcus never contacted her directly, but she heard through professional networks that he'd joined another development firm in a senior partnership role. The reports suggested he was thriving, leading aggressive projects with tight timelines and innovative financing. Evelyn felt no satisfaction in the news, just the quiet recognition that they'd each found paths consistent with their values, even if those paths had diverged permanently. On a cold afternoon in early spring, nearly 8 months after the board meeting that had fractured the partnership, Catherine Liu called requesting a site visit. She arrived with 2 associates, dressed in practical boots and a jacket that suggested she was prepared to actually walk the construction zones rather than just observe from safe distance. Tony led the tour, explaining the foundation system with obvious pride, pointing out how the hybrid approach addressed the subsurface variations, showing the monitoring systems that tracked drainage performance in real time. Catherine listened intently, asked technical questions that demonstrated genuine understanding, and several times nodded in what looked like approval. They ended the tour in the temporary site office, gathered around the table where construction drawings competed for space with coffee cups and hard hats. "I've seen a lot of construction projects," Catherine said. "Very few of them take this much care with foundations. Most developers treat it as a necessary expense to get through as quickly and cheaply as possible." "Most developers don't have someone like Caleb pointing out what they're missing," Evelyn replied. "Or someone like you willing to listen when it's expensive and inconvenient." Catherine looked at the construction timeline posted on the wall, showing current progress against projected milestones. "You're 3 weeks ahead of schedule. Tony runs a tight operation, and when you design properly from the start, construction actually goes smoother." "Imagine that. Doing things right saves time in the long run." Catherine's tone was dry but pleased. "I'm bringing in 2 more projects that need this level of diligence. Existing buildings that need foundation assessment and possible retrofit. Interested?" Evelyn felt something shift in her chest. Not quite relief, but the easing of pressure she'd been carrying since the partnership dissolution. New projects meant the company would survive, that the choices she'd made wouldn't end in complete financial ruin. "Very interested. Send me the details. I'll have my team put together briefing materials. But Evelyn, I need to know something. If you encounter the same situation again, difficult partner, financial pressure, warning signs that everyone wants to ignore, would you make the same choice?" It was the question Evelyn had been asking herself for months, testing her conviction against the reality of consequences. She'd lost her partnership, nearly destroyed her company, spent countless hours in difficult conversations and negotiations that wouldn't have been necessary if she'd just trusted Marcus's confidence and moved forward. But she'd also built something that would last, foundations that would hold weight for decades, structures that wouldn't slowly fail under the burden of loads they weren't designed to carry. She'd learned to trust her judgment even when it conflicted with expertise and experience, and she'd discovered that the cost of doing things right, however significant in the moment, was ultimately bearable in ways that the cost of doing things wrong never would be. "Yes," she said simply. "I'd make the same choice." Catherine smiled. "Good. That's exactly what I needed to hear." The Riverside development was completed on the revised timeline, finishing in late summer with a formal opening that drew attention from the architectural community and local media. The coverage focused on the innovative foundation design, the comprehensive approach to subsurface challenges, and the developer's willingness to delay construction to ensure structural integrity. Evelyn gave interviews explaining the decision process, carefully avoiding criticism of Marcus while making clear that prioritizing safety had been non-negotiable. The first residents moved in on a warm September afternoon, families carrying boxes and furniture up elevators into apartments that sat on foundations engineered to handle every variation in the bedrock below. Evelyn watched from the street, standing beside Caleb, both of them seeing the surface result of decisions that had been made 60 feet underground. "You did good work here," Caleb said. "We did good work here. You're the one who noticed the problem in the first place." "I just pointed at a puddle. You're the one who had the courage to actually investigate it. And you're the one who showed up every week to make sure the investigation translated into proper construction." He smiled. "So we both did good work." "Yeah, we did." Emma ran up, slightly out of breath, her soccer uniform grass-stained from a game she'd played that morning. "Dad, Ms. Liu wants to talk to you about the next project, something about old warehouses that need foundation checks. Tell her I'll be there in a minute." Emma nodded and ran back toward where Catherine was talking with Richard and Tony, her energy undiminished by a full day of activity. "She's grown," Evelyn observed. 3 inches since this all started. I can barely keep her in shoes that fit." "I meant maturity-wise. She seems more confident. She's had good examples. You, Richard, even Tony. She's been watching adults do difficult things and handle them with integrity. That matters more than people realize." They stood in comfortable silence, watching movers navigate furniture through doorways, listening to the sounds of families beginning their lives in spaces that existed because someone had insisted on doing things correctly despite every pressure to compromise. Evelyn's phone buzzed. A text from Jennifer. Board meeting next week to discuss Catherine's new projects. She wants to formalize the partnership structure. This is happening. She smiled, feeling possibility expand in ways it hadn't since before the partnership dissolution. The company hadn't just survived the Riverside crisis, it had emerged stronger, with a reputation for integrity and a new investor who valued diligence over speed. I need to head out, Caleb said. Promised Emma I'd take her for ice cream after the soccer game. But Evelyn, before I go, thank you. For what? You're the one who saved this project from being a disaster. For listening when you didn't have to. For taking me seriously when everyone else was dismissing my concerns as uninformed interference. For being willing to risk everything you'd built because it was the right thing to do. You make it sound noble. Mostly I was just terrified I was making a massive mistake. Being terrified and doing it anyway is basically the definition of courage. Then I guess we're both pretty courageous. You for speaking up when staying quiet would have been safer, me for acting on what you said, even when it cost everything. We make a good team. Yeah, we do. He walked toward his truck, Emma already climbing into the passenger seat, chattering about the game and the ice cream she'd earned through 3 solid hours of running. Evelyn watched them drive away, this small family that had somehow become central to the most significant professional transformation of her life. Her phone rang. Catherine, her tone brisk but warm. Evelyn, I've been thinking about the partnership structure. What would you say to bringing Caleb in as a formal principal? Equal stake in the company, focused on quality oversight across all projects? He runs an auto shop. That's his primary business. So he keeps running it. We structure this so he can do both. Maintain his existing work and provide the kind of independent perspective that makes our projects better than everyone else's. Evelyn considered the proposal, thinking about what it would mean to formalize what had already become reality. Caleb was already integral to how they approach projects, his perspective valued precisely because it came from outside traditional development expertise. Let me talk to him, see if he's interested. Do that. But Evelyn, I'm serious about this. What we've built with Riverside is rare. A development process that actually prioritizes long-term structural integrity over short-term profit maximization. That's valuable. That's sustainable. And Caleb is a key part of why it works. The call ended, and Evelyn stood on the sidewalk watching the Riverside buildings catch the late afternoon sunlight, their windows reflecting gold and amber as day transitioned toward evening. She thought about foundations and partnerships, about the difference between building for appearance and building to last, about what it meant to construct something that would hold weight long after the people who created it were gone. Her phone buzzed again. This time, a text from Caleb. Emma says you should come to her soccer game next Saturday. She claims you're her good luck charm because we've won every game since you started coming to the construction site. I told her correlation doesn't equal causation, but she's unmoved by logic. Evelyn laughed and texted back, "Tell her I'll be there," and that her grasp of superstition is more sophisticated than my grasp of soccer rules, so we're even. His response, "She says that's fair, and she'll explain offsides to you if you bring snacks. Deal." Saturday arrived with perfect weather, the kind of clear autumn day that made everything feel possible. Evelyn arrived at the soccer field with a bag of orange slices and granola bars, finding Caleb on the sideline watching Emma's team warm up. He'd clearly come straight from the shop, his clothes carrying the faint smell of motor oil and his hands showing the residual staining that never quite washed completely away. "She's actually good," Evelyn said, watching Emma execute a passing drill with casual competence. "She's starting to be." Took her a while to trust that she could be aggressive without being mean, that competing hard doesn't make you a bad person. That's a sophisticated distinction for a 9-year-old. She's had to think about a lot of sophisticated things. Losing her mom young, watching me navigate single parenthood, being part of conversations about structural integrity and building safety. She grew up fast in some ways. But she's still a kid. Yeah, that's the balance, letting her be mature when it matters while protecting the space for her to just be 9 years old, who loves soccer and ice cream and decorating hard hats with stickers. The game started, and Emma's team played with enthusiastic chaos that gradually cohered into something resembling strategy. Emma scored twice, both times off corner kicks she'd apparently been practicing, both times celebrating with her teammates with unrestrained joy. During halftime, Caleb turned to Evelyn with unusual seriousness. Catherine called me about the partnership proposal, making me a formal principal in the company. What do you think? I think it's generous and probably more than I deserve, given that I just point out problems without solving them. You do more than that. You provide perspective that none of the rest of us have. You ask questions we don't think to ask. You notice things we're too busy or too confident to see. That's not worth a partnership stake. Catherine thinks it is, so do I. He watched Emma's team return to the field for the second half, his expression thoughtful. If I do this, I need to keep running the shop. That's non-negotiable. It's my primary business, my identity, the thing I'm actually qualified to do. Understood. We'd structure it so you can do both. And I need to maintain boundaries around time with Emma. I can't be at every meeting or every site visit. She comes first. Of course she does. That's what makes you good at this. You have priorities that aren't just about the project or the profit. Then I'll do it with those conditions. Welcome to the partnership, Caleb. They shook hands just as Emma scored her third goal, this one from outside the penalty box with a shot that curved past the goalkeeper with surprising precision. She turned and pointed at them, grinning with the pure satisfaction of someone who'd executed exactly what she'd been practicing. After the game, they took Emma for the promised ice cream, sitting at a small outdoor table while she demolished a cone approximately the size of her head and recounted every significant play with detailed analysis. Ms. Ross, Emma said between bites, Dad says you're going to be working together more now, that you're partners. That's right. That's good. You're smart and you listen to him even when other people don't. Plus you bring good snacks. High praise. I'm serious. Most adults don't listen to Dad because he fixes cars instead of doing fancy business stuff. But you listened when it mattered. That's rare. Evelyn met Caleb's eyes over Emma's head, seeing the same mixture of pride and slight embarrassment that came from your child articulating truths you'd have expressed less directly. Your dad notices things that matter, Evelyn said. That's worth listening to regardless of what his business card says. Exactly. That's what I keep telling him, but he doesn't always believe me. Maybe he'll believe both of us. Emma nodded sagely. Probably. He's stubborn, but not stupid. Caleb laughed. Thanks for that ringing endorsement, Em. You're welcome. Can we go home now? I have homework and I'm tired from scoring 3 goals. They drove back to the city as evening settled, the sky turning shades of purple and pink that reflected off glass and steel. All those buildings standing because someone had made good decisions about what held them up. Evelyn followed Caleb's truck to his neighborhood, a quiet residential area where houses had yards and trees and the kind of settled permanence that came from communities that had existed for generations. She parked and walked to where Caleb was helping Emma out of the truck, the girl clutching her soccer trophy from the game, a small plastic figure mounted on a wooden base that she'd earned for being named player of the match. Thanks for coming today, Caleb said. It meant a lot to Emma, to both of us. Thanks for inviting me. It's easy to forget that life is more than work and projects and board meetings. Sometimes you need to watch 9-year-olds play soccer and eat ice cream. That's pretty much my entire philosophy of balance. Emma tugged on his sleeve. Dad, can Ms. Ross come to dinner next week? I want to show her my science project about soil composition and building foundations. It's really good. I'm sure it is, but Ms. Ross is probably busy. I'd love to, Evelyn interrupted. What night works for you? Emma's face lit up. Tuesday. I don't have soccer, and Dad usually makes pasta, which is really good even though he pretends he's not a good cook. Tuesday it is. She drove home feeling something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Contentment. Not the satisfied exhaustion that came from completing a difficult project, or the relieved tension of avoiding disaster, but genuine contentment with where she was and who she was becoming. The company had survived and was growing stronger. The Riverside development stood on foundations that would last generations. She'd found a partnership built on shared values rather than just shared profit motive. And she'd discovered that doing the right thing, even when it cost everything, ultimately led to places she couldn't have reached any other way. Tuesday's dinner was exactly as promised. Caleb's pasta, which was considerably better than he'd admitted, Emma's science project, which demonstrated sophisticated understanding of soil mechanics and foundation engineering, and conversation that ranged from soccer strategy to building safety to Emma's concerns about middle school next year. Over the following months, the pattern became routine. Weekly dinners, occasional soccer games, irregular but consistent presence in each other's lives that wasn't quite family, but was definitely more than professional colleagues. Emma appointed herself the official quality control officer for all the company's projects, conducting inspections that mostly involved asking detailed questions and taking very seriously her responsibility to ensure proper foundations. The retrofit projects Catherine had brought became successful case studies in how to address subsurface challenges in existing buildings, the careful investigation and conservative engineering earning recognition from the professional community and additional business from property owners who valued integrity over expedience. A year after the Riverside opening, Evelyn stood on the same street corner where she'd first watched residents move in, this time accompanied by Caleb and Emma and Catherine and Richard, all of them gathering for a community celebration that marked the development's first anniversary. The buildings had performed exactly as designed. No settling, no structural stress, no drainage problems despite a rainy winter that would have overwhelmed less robust systems. The residents had organized the celebration themselves, wanting to acknowledge that they were living in something built with genuine care for their safety and longevity. Emma, now 10 and somehow even taller, stood between Evelyn and Caleb holding both their hands. "You know what's cool?" she said. "What's cool?" Caleb asked. "These buildings are going to be here when I'm old, like really old, and they'll still be standing because you guys made sure the foundations were right." "That is pretty cool," Evelyn agreed. "And when I'm old and I tell people about how you fixed the buildings before they were even broken, they'll think I'm making it up because it sounds too smart." "Well, you can show them the engineering reports if they don't believe you." "I will. I'm keeping all of them, for evidence." The celebration continued into the evening, food trucks and music and the particular energy of a community that felt genuine investment in the place they called home. Evelyn found herself talking with residents who'd chosen Riverside specifically because of its reputation for structural integrity, who appreciated living in buildings constructed by people who'd prioritize safety over schedule. As the sun set and lights began appearing in windows across the development, Caleb found Evelyn near the edge of the crowd, both of them watching the scene with quiet satisfaction. "You know what I realized?" he said. "What?" "That night at Danny's bar when you first asked about the Riverside area, I almost didn't say anything, almost just kept my concerns to myself and let someone else deal with it. What changed your mind?" "You. The way you actually listened when I mentioned the foundation problems. Most people would have dismissed it or changed the subject. You paid attention, made me think maybe saying something actually mattered." "It did matter. It changed everything." "Yeah, for both of us." They stood in comfortable silence as the evening deepened, watching Emma chase other kids around the plaza, her laughter carrying across the space between buildings that stood on foundations engineered to last, constructed by people who'd chosen truth over convenience and discovered that the choice, however costly in the moment, had been worth everything it required. And in that moment, on that corner, surrounded by structures that would outlast them all, Evelyn understood what Caleb had known from the beginning, that showing up mattered, that speaking truth mattered, that building things to last required courage and integrity and the willingness to do what was right even when it destroyed everything else. The buildings stood, the foundations held, and the lives built upon them flourished in ways that justified every difficult decision, every costly delay, every moment of doubt that had preceded the certainty of knowing they'd done the work correctly. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything that mattered.